Hello guys, today we will be talking about what if Naruto had time travel jutsu part 1. If you enjoyed this video please like and subscribe. Now let's begin. Hello guys, today we will be talking about what if Naruto had time travel jutsu part 1. If you enjoyed this video please like and subscribe. Now let's begin. Hit him with what? A snide voice replied, coming from the corner of his peripheral. Your non-existent breasts. You moron. Ah. And apparently the watering can just hit someone else's head. The girl with the disturbing face turned around again, a curious expression to her. So sorry about that. But, what are you doing, anyway? Her hair was short and swung up on her head in a small ponytail. She braced her weight on one leg in a defiant manner, canting her hip, watering can at her side. Her brown eyes were big and blinked down at him in curiosity. It was the face though, which completed the picture. Tsunade. He gaped, and then sputtered. And then tried not to scream. Is something wrong, Tsunade-chan? Came a voice in mild vexation. The amount of resignation ladled into the worn words told him things tended to go wrong quite frequently. The girl spun around quickly, voice sheepish. Not really, sensei. And with a brief glance to Naruto, there was a boy sleeping in the watermelon patch, though. The man came into view. Naruto blinked. Oh god. Oh god. The Sandame Hokage. Young. Sarutobi gave him a familiarly pleasant smile. Oh? And who might you be? Naruto began, with varying degrees of panic rising in his voice. And with frightening came Jiraiya's voice. Trust no one. Aye. Naruto sputtered some more. The Sandame was patient, however, and only nodded and waited. Tsunade and a morbidly younger version of Jiraiya leaned closer with equal interest. Well, I make sure to be cautious. Don't go around telling anyone who you are, and for Christ's sake, especially not your heritage. Even if they're familiar faces, remember that once wrong word and you may mess up the whole future. Remember the ninja code. Keep your guard up. Trust no one, you hear me? Trust no one. The sealing paper began to heat, the seals lighting in the most brilliant shade of blue Naruto had ever seen, ascending into the sky at an alarming rate and burning a glow of azure around the delighted blonde. He looked up to his teacher, whose eyes were wide and frightened, but imploring. See ya, Uro-sennin. The glow of the seal shot to the sky, before they faded into a wispy charcoal black on the rice paper. Jiraiya stared at it with a mix of emotions, the wind fluttering on the top of the hill, making the edges of the paper lift a bit. Then, he sighed. He better not screw this up. Naruto felt like someone just hit him on the back of the head with a large, tin object. Then realized someone had. A watering can, in fact. He'd been conscious for about a half a second and was halfway into a sitting position before the preemptive strike collided with the bottom half of his brain, and successfully toppled him face first into the dirt. The blonde groaned and attempted to wiggle his hands out from underneath him to feel for the blow, in the process eating more dirt than he'd have liked. Behind him, he heard a shocked gasp. Sensei. I think I might have hit him. And then, with emphasis, on accident. Accident his ass, Naruto thought to himself as he pulled himself up in an attempt to see his assailant. He saw nothing of what he assumed was a whiny little girl, though his face was met with the largest watermelon he'd ever seen in his life. If his head was the size of the moon then this thing had to be twice the size of the earth. He sat straighter, only to realize that every other watermelon in the patch resembled this one in bust and length. Dotting the horizon was a small farmhouse. Naruto was pretty sure they didn't even make them this large anymore. Great, he probably crash-landed in the middle of nowhere, probably a desert, probably Suna. Was this really his lot in life? Forever waylaid by fate's constant jackassery? Instead, he was met with the view of an enormous city, the infamous Konoha gates looming in the distance, just as he remembered them. And before them, something even more familiar. Watch it. Jiraiya barked as he strayed too far to the left, completely upending Naruto's concentration. Gah! Naruto jumped, nearly spraying the ink all over the paper. It wasn't working, however. Look, kid. Jiraiya began irately. Fix the smudge in the right translation, know your other right. And then double back to the left and fix the one near the upper right corner. Naruto grumbled in response, settling into a more comfortable position to paint. After fixing most of the errors until the seal was near perfection, Jiraiya paced relentlessly back and forth with vigor, sending furtive glances to the seal, and then to the ground, continuously instilling an unwilling nervousness in the blonde the longer he went at it. The seal was perfect already. What more did it need? He thought Jiraiya was just being overly worrying. "Hello?" Naruto waved a hand. "Can I go yet?" "No." Naruto pulled away, frowning. Jiraiya began to pace again, this time in a circular motion. "Now? No. Now? No. Now? God damn it." Jiraiya cursed, looking ready to breathe fire. "If you keep acting like a whiny, immature gen, then I'll kick you out right now and burn this paper to ashes." Naruto opened his mouth. "Wahey, silence!" and promptly snapped it shut. Then the pacing began anew, the man changing the patterns depending on his thought. Sideways, in circles, in long wavy lines, until finally Jiraiya became unoriginal and just paced in a straight line. Naruto watched him with a frown, looking quite sullen. He'd been waiting for months for this opportunity, and Jiraiya looked halfway to blowing the whole project up and calling it a day. But the blonde had put too much time, effort, and hope into the finalization of this seal that he'd be more than a bit dismayed if Jiraiya called it quits. In fact, he'd probably just do it himself, to hell with all the chances. And then finally, he sighed for the umpteenth time that day. "Okay. Go." Naruto jumped in his joy, pouncing onto his glowing seals and began his long set of hand seals. Jiraiya swapped him on the back of the head again, for good measure, sending him toppling into the grass. "It matters, Gaki. This is just a simple mistake, maybe change your hair green, but what if it was in the center graph? You could botch the entire thing. Move your spleen to your lungs. But it's not. But what if it was? What's with all the what-ifs? I'm fine." Clearly Naruto's inability to see reason would win over his brain every time. Jiraiya slapped his forehead. Of all the genius seal makers in the world, of all the hard workers with determination, skill and luck, this boy seemed to be the one who just didn't understand. He sucked techniques like a vacuum, but precautions went out the window. Jiraiya begrudgingly thought it had something to do with Kyuubi. The fox simply patched the boy up no matter what happened. It was a truly unbecoming way to learn the responsibilities and repercussions of incredibly dangerous actions. Jiraiya tried a different approach. "I know that you're a bit reckless, Naruto, and I'm aware that, for some unfathomable reason, it's seemed to work pretty good for you in the past. But one of these days that's all gonna catch up to you. You gotta think things through, you know? Really take the time to learn everything, even all the what-ifs, cause one of these days they'll really bite you in the ass." Naruto huffed, though his eyes were wide and understanding. "I know, you old senin. You act like I still run around and paint the Hokage mountain in neons, piss a Viruka-sensei and get into fights I know I can't win. I'm not like that anymore." Jiraiya wanted to point out that the latter of the three had already been done, this morning in fact, but refrained. Instead, he sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine. Do a once-over." Naruto's grin split his face. He won. So he turned around and began to check his seal, currently glowing a brilliant shade of blinding blue. There were 4 parts, the center, and the most important, the 2 flanking at the top and 2 at the bottom. Each were circular in pattern. Each contained so many little details that looking at it to check made his head spin. Sealing graphs were like math equations and languages. It had only been a few hours and already it was starting to give him a headache. "Have you looked?" Jiraiya called, just this side of nagging. "Made sure? Everything's in order?" If Naruto hadn't known any better, he'd have thought Jiraiya was just being a cranky, impatient old man. But he was aware that everything Jiraiya had done this morning, from struggling up the hill to painting the seals, had been carried a vague sense of trepidation. A wariness, an unease, that settled predominantly because of him. Because of concern for him. The idea was touching enough that it stilled some of Naruto's lesser words for the man. Yeah. The blonde nodded. I looked. The Sannin stepped forward to inspect the graphs himself. It only took a matter of seconds. 15 graphs to the right, center fold. You messed up. The units are supposed to be translated from the right, not the left. Naruto made a noise of frustration, whether at Jiraiya for being so quick about it, or for himself for making the mistake in the first place. One would never know taking an ink and quill and redoing it on the rice paper. He tried to be careful not to ruin it. Naruto surmised that the reason no one ever took him seriously clearly had to do with his unastounding height of 5'6". If he was any taller, certainly people would take him more seriously. As a ninja, and as a person though invariably, he'd ruined the latter of the two through the notorious and infamous pranks of his youth. Alright. So that may have something to do with it. But undoubtedly he'd done his fair share of growing up since then, anyone would say so. Well, perhaps not Sakura-chan. Or Kakashi-sensei. Or, for that matter, Jiraiya. Who, still, since the two had trekked up the hill that sunrise, continued his deep and uninterrupted monologue on the variables of sealing that Naruto had already learned, had never found a use for, or just plain were never in use to begin with. The blonde had attempted an intervention twice, each of the times had the young shinobi hazarding a round kick to the face and a furthering of the winded, one-sided conversation. This is very dangerous, Naruto. He pattered on, as he had been for the better part of the morning. You could get severely hurt or worse. Damage the entire fate of the world by messing up and opening your goddamn mouth. Jeez, Jiraiya. Naruto interrupted, and ducked the swing he knew was coming. You've been talking in circles all morning. Can't we get a move on? A supremely dangerous look crossed the old Sannin's face. A move on? Clearly, Naruto, we can't, if you're not taking this serious enough and have enough energy to pick your ear when you should be devoting all of it to listening. Guiltlessly, the blonde popped his index out of his said hearing appendage, before yawning unceremoniously. Yesh. He muttered to himself. Guy can't catch a break around here? And then, louder, and with a valiant attempt at keeping the whine out of his voice, come on you old pervert, we've been studying this for months. I get it already. You don't. That's the point. You're about to do something that hasn't and shouldn't ever been done before. This gave him pause. Well, yeah. But I'm doing it anyways, right? The Sannin wore a look of clear anger and exasperation. There was nothing that would skyrocket his blood pressure more than a kid with a mulish head and a bravery streak a mile wide, who wanted nothing more than to prove himself. And he'd had his fair share of those. Though Naruto was different than Nagato, Yahiko, or Konan. And not just because he was Minato's son. He was the first to truly grasp such a complex concept so naturally, and there was a strange mixture of pride and anxiety he got like a blow to the gut each time he thought of the boy. There was a feeling of satisfaction that welled in his stomach when he thought of how far Naruto had come, and yet dually, it warred with the constant threat of how easily this could destroy the last vestige of Minato he'd ever have. Mostly though, Jiraiya just wished Naruto would understand how precautious he should be when it came to this sealing business. It certainly wasn't the most blunt of art, and Naruto, if anything, was a tactless, blunt kind of guy. Jiraiya shook his heads. No. Naruto would probably never appreciate the effervescent subtleties of this unique trade. Yes, you are. Jiraiya supposed with a sigh. But really, you have to be careful. I won't always be here to check your seals for mistakes, brat. I know. Though in retrospect, the blonde would come to realize he really didn't know, in any sense of the word. But for now, he was under the complete impression that whatever life, and in this case, sealing, could throw at him, he'd take it like a man and throw it back in its face. See? The gray-haired sage waved wildly, smacking the blonde upside the head before he could dodge. You're just saying that, if you did. Jiraiya pointed out a mistake in graphing near the center left of the glowing blue seal. Then you would have noticed that you misplaced this fracture. It's supposed to be 3 units to the right. Naruto groaned, bending down with an ink pot to fix the mistake, careful not to smudge the remaining characters on the paper. He finished the line of characters, rolling on his heels to study it with a bored expression. Gah. What does it matter anyway? Naruto stretched his hands over his head, looking like he was about to finally lumber out of bed. This was the 5th attempt this morning before, after a moment of deliberation, he flopped back onto bed. This was the first time he'd been able to sleep in for a couple months, and he was going to relish it, and prolong it for as long as he could. His head had been pounding since the middle of the night, and he was hoping that maybe he could sleep it off. His entire body ached, and he felt as if he'd been on death's door for the majority of the week, though in actuality, he'd spent the most of it sleeping. Eventually though, the sun managed to oust him completely, as not even his shut blinds could fully keep it out. Running a hand through his unruly mussed hair, he rummaged through his closet with blurry, sleep eyes, scouring its depth for something that wasn't colorful, which was a feat in itself. He pried out an old, wrinkly dark shirt to wear over his mesh quarter sleeve, pulling on shinobi cargo pants, and was about to reach for his high tie 8, when he realized he'd put them all on inside out. After redoing his attire, he mused whether perhaps he should tell Jiraiya that today might not be such a great idea. Maybe he should tell Jiraiya he wasn't ready. Nah. Naruto could handle anything that came his way, whether 13 years in the past or not. Naruto. Are you in there? Sakura-chan's voice was coming from the other side of his apartment door. Pulling pants on and stumbling into his hallway, he unlocked it. She stepped in with a bit of a frosty air to her demeanor, and Naruto immediately cringed. He did something. Didn't he? One look in her eyes told him that yes, he did something very, very stupid. There was silence. I heard. Heard what? Naruto fidgeted. He hated silence. It brought back bad memories. Jiraiya told me. Her eyes were throwing kunai at him. He blinked, gripping his hallway table. He did? Yeah. She nodded, crossing arms over her chest. He was very vague, but he said something about you and... Sakura was searching his eyes for something. He made sure to blink slowly. Some sort of ceiling. Ah. He scratched the back of his head. Did he really? Yeah. I'm starting one of the way cooler chapters now. Not just turning leaves into grass and that stuff. Actually, you know, I was supposed to meet him today. I understand, Naruto. Sakura said softly. That you might not come back. And he was, huh? The blonde sputtered. Jiraiya-sama had said something about how dangerous it was. And you might not make it back. Naruto looked at her fondly, an odd mixture of a smile on his face. I'll be back, Sakura-chan. She nodded, a hopeful smile on her face. Ramen? Naruto wiggled his eyebrows. Date? No way. Naruto growled, swiveling around. Deciding Orochimaru wasn't enough of a threat in his current state, he went back to graphing the glowing seals. Orochimaru watched intently with those sickly golden eyes of his. Naruto knew he hadn't done anything yet, but he couldn't help it. God, just the fact that Orochimaru was standing not even 10 feet from his and he could kill him at any moment made his fingers twitch uncontrollably. What are those seals for? Stop asking questions. Are you trying to invade us? Orochimaru scowled. Are you? He asked again. No. Hypocrite. Naruto wanted to point out to him, but the young snake hadn't done anything criminal yet. Then what are they for? Groaning, Naruto finally looked up, an annoyed look etched into his face. Shut up, will you? This takes concentration. His face showed anger, but he kept his mouth shut, watching intently as Naruto painted more of the seals. The fire crackled in the distance, the shadows dancing in its wake, and small sparks shot off like shooting stars. His yellow eyes shifted from the blonde who was squatting down and graphing more seals on his array, to the fire that roared in quiet rage next to the boy, painting light in odd angles. Naruto didn't have to turn around to know that something had caught Orochimaru's interest, just the fact that he had went quiet was enough. Will you teach me? Don't you have a sensei? Naruto retorted. Orochimaru frowned. He doesn't teach us anything. There was an undertone to his voice that made Naruto's spine go rigid. Was he under the impression that nothing Sarutobi taught them was useful? Was that one of the reasons for his descent into madness? Though Naruto could argue the guy was just a crazy fuck to begin with, But even if he did teach the boy something absolutely pointless and stupid, would it help any? And Jiraiya did say not to mess anything up. Gah. Whatever, he'd teach him something stupid and pointless that the boy would think was amazing. Just like younger Jiraiya, except that it wouldn't be a pretty blonde girl dancing around with enormous boobs. Okay, gather chakra into your fingers. It was hard to see if Orochimaru was doing that, but the snake nodded. Now snap them. A little pitiful flame sparked for a moment above his 2 fingers, and the young criminal-to-be widened his eyes. Well, at least the seal was done now. Orochimaru was still gaping at his fingers, so Naruto took this as a perfect moment to hightail it out of here. He stepped into the paper quickly just as the seals flashed a bright blue, shooting into the night sky like stars. Then, nothing was left except for charcoal black seals that were burnt until it was impossible to read them, and a still gaping Orochimaru. Whether from the seals or from the lame fire technique it was unknown. I'll teach you the ultimate of all ultimate techniques, if you keep your mouth shut about this. Jiraiya nodded, making gestures about zipping his lips and throwing away the lock. Naruto grinned. Okay, watch this. There was a pause, filled with a flurry of hand seals, and then, Oryak no Jutsu. A busty blonde with bigger assets than the future Tsunade had began to make hissy noises at Jiraiya, who promptly held back a nosebleed. Yes, this would definitely keep the young silver-haired boy quiet for most of his life. Naruto's clone dispersed in a plume of smoke, leaving a starry-eyed Jiraiya in its wake. That was the coolest, most amazing thing I've ever seen. Naruto nodded. Great. Now run along. Jiraiya gave him an ecstatic wave, before scurrying off back to his team. Naruto sighed. Damn. He still had a whole other translation to do until he could go back, and the light was already fading. That whole Jiraiya thing must have taken about half an hour or so, and he no longer had much sunlight to work with. But, reasoned, it wasn't as if he lacked the knowledge of a good Katen jutsu or two to help him out. He looked around the dense brambles and the trees that loomed over him. Konoha was known for its trees and woodlife. Honestly, where were the twigs? After much hunting, he gathered the twigs in a pile, and snapped his fingers, a light burning faintly between them where chakra pulsed into the air. Naruto grinned triumphantly. There we go, I saw that, ah damn. Another one. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he stood to his full height, the shadows from his fire casting long, flickering shadows onto his face. Orochimaru emerged from the shadows, almost ethereal paleness framed by the firelight. There was something dark and tenebrous in his eyes, even at this age. It was almost disturbing, and Naruto shivered. It'd be so easy to end it all, right now. He knew that it'd only mess everything up further, so he opted to just glare heatedly at him. His golden eyes looked bright and eerie in the lighting. Inhuman, almost. You made fire. Without hand seals. Naruto's eyes were chilling. What of it? The gaze went back to him, an intense look to it. How did you do it? Naruto snorted. Like I'm gonna teach you. Orochimaru frowned. Naruto thought it too sick to actually call it a pout, because that did not bode well at all, and crossed his arms over the weird kimono he wore. You taught the Dobi that insufferable technique. You saw that? Naruto laughed. No wonder there was a little bit of dried blood under his nose. Teach me. Naruto Diankyo. Shit. He didn't remember. He dived for his backpack, lying behind him with all his sealing supplies and a copy of Sealing, for Dummies, which was probably his only hope at this point, even though it had absolutely nothing on time travel. He hoisted the big tome of sealing charts, skipping to the more fishy section with much more theory and probability. His heart thrummed as his reality caught up to him. This was the first time anyone had sealed to the past purposefully. And as of now, he was going to be the first to ever get back, too. It was like one big adventure, the biggest adventure of his life and probably at this point the coolest. The only thing in his memory that compared was the wave mission gone wrong back when they were all genin. Of course, he didn't do cool things back then like time travel, but it was cool for genin to get an A-class mission like that. Let's see. So you do switch the intervals. So he completed his seal in the clearing, the foliage not exactly aiding him as the huge canopy of leaves kept dappling the light. It must have been around dusk, because the light was getting poorer. He wondered as he flipped another page and began to ready his ink what season it was. He wasn't exactly a farmer, so he wasn't sure what season watermelons grew, but he was thinking it was either spring or summer, so the lighting shouldn't be this bad. Oh. Hey. Startled by the loud voice, Naruto almost dropped his book into the ink pot. He shrieked and dived for the book just in time, though, and managed to salvage the ink. He sent a dark look to the area the voice came from. "You're the dude Tsunade hit with her watering can," Jiraiya pointed out unnecessarily. Gah. Jiraiya gaped at the glowing seal, jaw hitting the floor and eyes bulging. "Whoa. You made this? This is totally rad." The younger version of Jiraiya fluttered around the seal with pure amazement, a bit like a social butterfly. He kept pointing out different parts of the seal, the easier parts, and saying how he knew all about them. Naruto sighed. This boy was such a nerd. A perverted nerd. And thinking of how perverted and nerdy, writing porn novels and spying on naked women? Naruto wasn't sure if that was perverted or nerdy or both. The Jiraiya of his time was. He knew this boy wasn't going to get any better. "Yeah, this is mine." Jiraiya blinked. "I've been studying seals for ages. Sensei won't teach me any because he thinks they're too dangerous and we don't know much about them, but I want to be a sealing master." Naruto resisted the urge to laugh. "Yeah, that's great, kid." He waved the young Sannin off. "Now why don't you?" But Jiraiya began to bounce. "I've gotta tell Sensei." "Hey." Naruto pulled him back. "You can't tell your sensei." "Why not?" Jiraiya waggled his eyebrows. "Are you a criminal?" Naruto groaned. "No, but I don't want to alert anyone that a sealing master is here." "You're a sealing master?" came the breathless, amazed interruption. "Well shit. There goes his cover." Naruto leaned down, suddenly proud of the fact he was actually taller than someone to level height with the young Jiraiya, currently pouting and crossing his arms like the 12-year-old boy he was in this timeline. Rakamaru, who had continued to water the plants with Doomravi Umlagems unrawhide all of this, turned to look with what could have been a vague amount of interest. Naruto took in a breath, and then, "I think I have amnesia," he finished lamely. "Oh." Came Sandame's equally lame retaliation. "Oh." Tsunade perked up suddenly with a gush. Amnesia is when someone forgets something for a short period of time. I read about it in my medical book. Sometimes it can last for minutes, sometimes for years and wow, breastless. Jiraiya rolled his eyes. "Everyone knows that." "Shut up." He was sent flying. "I'm going to be a medic nin." "What are you going to do with your pathetic life?" "I'm gonna be a super pervert." Smack. Jiraiya landed somewhere on the other side of the farm, near the legumes. Naruto watched them with a fair amount of amusement, but mostly with nostalgia. It almost hurt to look at them, so naive and happy. Even Orochimaru, the creep he was, seemed to have an air of immaturity to him. An innocence that would be lost quite quickly in the future. Naruto could recall days like this in his own past, with a bouncy Sakura and an impassive, but secretly bemused Sasuke. And that hurt to think of more than anything. As a dull ache of remorse shot through him, Sarutobi spoke up again. "This sounds serious," he mused, though there was a twinkle in his eye. "Perhaps we should escort you to the hospital, young man?" he inquired. "Oh no." Naruto backtracked quickly. "I'm sure I'll be fine. I'll probably just, walk around and see if anything will spark my memory." "An admirable idea." The Sandame smiled. He found his eyes unintentionally strained to Orochimaru, who was somewhat far off, still watering the plants. At this age, it was hard to tell him apart from any other genius asshole that Konoha seemed to crap out with a vengeance, and he could sort of see how Orochimaru had so easily flown under the radar for so many years. Though the thought did not sit well with him. He hoisted himself up as Sarutobi gravitated towards his genin, apparently lecturing to them about the importance of teamwork. Tsunade was grumbling, and Jiraiya was whining vocally, and Naruto could have laughed at the ironic, repetitive circles the world worked in. Figuring he'd spent enough time in this particular era, and more than enough for his first journey. He hunted around for a secure place to build his seal. He was on the outskirts of Konoha, so probably somewhere around here was a good place to start. He hurried to the back of the farmhouse and Sandame continued to lecture his bemoaning students, passing cluster of trees and delving a bit further into the forest. He rummaged around for his rice paper after finding suitable clearing, and began to ruminate on how, exactly, he'd be getting back to his time. Jiraiya had briefly mentioned, labored over for hours, something about switching the left and right intervals, and anyway, I've got a mission report to turn in. He lied easily, giving them all one last lingering look. See you around, huh? Maybe we'll meet again. Though there was no maybe in the reality of it. His younger Ramen and Sakura-obsessed self pouted, but said nothing. The other two seemed pleased he left. But he didn't care much. He was just glad he'd made a speedy exit, because there was no way he could even spend another second there. There was so much he wanted to reveal to his younger self, so many words of wisdom he wished someone had given to him at that age. So many warnings and so many encouragements, all of them making a bile he swallowed down thickly. Just keep walking, he told himself as he furiously tore through the streets. Keep walking and don't look back. He came to an abrupt stop a little ways off near the memorial, covered enough in canopy that no one would see. Here's good. He supposed to himself, eyeing the sun. He'd have enough daylight for nearly 7 hours. There were some things about ceiling that he'd just never get used to. Everything about it was so complex, each line, be it curved, straight, or a mixture of both, had to be executed perfectly on a certain spot on the paper in relation to the rest of the graph. And even then, the graph itself was in relation to itself. The entire formula had to be translated backwards to jump forward in time, a point that Naruto clearly seemed to get confused with jumping backwards, as he had to redo almost the entire bottom left circle. The sun was making a very, very slow ascent upward to the center of the sky when Naruto finished. It was terribly hot. Unlike the day he left with Jiraiya, there was no comforting breeze to keep the temperature from skyrocketing. At least the canopy that dappled the sunlight helped a little. But it also made it terribly humid. He wondered how he ever lived through this day before. I thought I'd find you here. Naruto jumped. Shit. He turned around slowly, eyes warily eyeing the jounin vest and the orange book placed so nonchalantly in gloved hands. He wondered, was it the book, the mask, or the hair that gave his sensei away? A part of him wanted to smile and say hello, but the more sane part smacked himself up the head and told him to think of something quick. I'm just enjoying the local fauna. He hedged uneasily. Kakashi swept an eye to the now glowing seal. I can see that. There was a beat of silence. Did you need something? You don't seem to have anything to hide, the silver-haired man appraised with a light voice, making like he hadn't heard the blonde at all. But your stance is so rigid, it leads me to believe I've overlooked something. Good to know. Naruto retorted. I'll learn to fix it. Sure you will. The copy nin flipped a page. It was an issue Naruto was familiar with, and for a moment he found himself wondering if Kakashi had made it to the part where Ki and Ringo started to have table sex, but then realized that perhaps he should concentrate on more demanding things. Like the S-class sensei facing him down. If you can make it out. Kakashi was fast, but luckily, Naruto knew his quirks. Kakashi never lunged completely straight, there was a crick that leaned to his uncovered eye. Naruto took the small opening to dodge around the jounin, blocking the kunai with his own. However, there was a reason Kakashi was still his sensei, and he scraped Naruto's cheek. He stepped out of the shrubbery, dancing across the bramble as he tried to get a vine off his foot. Ah shit fuck, he struggled in a 1v1 with the vine winning for most of it, until he just whipped out a kunai and lopped the whole thing off. By this point, he danced out into the center of a disturbingly familiar bridge, with 3 disturbingly familiar faces peering at him with expressions of disbelief and surprise. Hey! Sakura pointed wildly at him, looking just as surprised as she was worried. Who are you? He's a villain. His younger self shouted, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Let's fight him and save Konoha. You idiot. Sasuke muttered with emphasis, nudging to Naruto's forehead. He's got a height I8. The young blonde squinted at it, before rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. Oh yeah. Whoops. Yeah, you idiot. Sakura parroted, sticking her tongue out. His younger self returned it. Oh god. This was making out to be just awful. Soon the blonde turned back to him. But who are you, anyway? The blonde genin asked shrewdly. Me? Naruto pointed to himself, as if there could possibly be anyone else. Well, you see, it's a bit of a long story. You sound like our sensei. Sakura sniffed. Making up stupid excuses. Do they usually end with your sensei getting a lot of women and saving the world before getting dumped in a bush behind a bridge full of dumb kids? Sakura shrieked, and then, hey wait, what? Did you really get a lot of women? His younger self perked up, all loud and in his face. He almost flinched back, but held still. Of course. That's just a part of the game. Lots of women, and super cool missions. So you're a jounin, then? Naruto couldn't even get himself to look at the kid's fac. I've never seen you around before. He managed it somehow, though, looking straight into the obsidian eyes, their history playing through them like crackling, soundless film. Sasuke's face, are you scared, chicken? The blood down his neck and the needles in his spine as he insisted his body just moved on his own, the Sharingan in his eyes as he looked up into the blonde's red ones, bodies still connected from the hole in Naruto's lung. It wasn't this bad seeing the Uchiha in his time, with his utterly impassive visage, the cool dark of his eyes unfamiliar and alien on the pale face of someone he used to know. But here, where there was still a brief spark of life in their depths, where he still resembled the boy Naruto used to know, used to believe was his best friend, it hurt just that much more. He gulped though, attempting to shake the feeling away. Naruto tapped his forehead protector. You said it yourself. You could have just killed Iko no Hanin and taken it for yourself. Sasuke pointed out. You guys really believe I'm some sort of spy? Naruto grumbled. Wouldn't I be, you know, trying to shank the Hokage? And not sitting around talking to a bunch of genin? We're not a bunch of genin. His younger, more annoying self piped up angrily. I'm gonna be the best ninja in the whole world. He's got a point though. Sakura admitted quietly. Of course. Naruto answered quickly, taking it with shaking hands. There was a heavy pause, as Naruto waited with bated breath for the words he'd been hearing in his head all morning. Free to go. Jiraiya saluted, a wry smile on his face. Naruto saluted back, eagerly stepping into the middle of the seal. It burned ferociously at his feet. The light rose around him, seeming to collect in a cloud of blue before it shot into the sky. All that was left was a solemn-faced old man, and a burning, crumbling paper. Naruto's head hurt like a motherfucker. He was apparently in some underbrush, from the stick that was nicely wedged into his side and the leaves that tickled his nose. Popping his head out of the shrubbery, he took a look around. Konoha, definitely. The seal wasn't supposed to transport him too far away from its original place. He tried to look at the Hokage mountain, an easy way to tell what date it was, but it was blocked by a tree uprooted in front of him. Sometimes he wondered if he was going to get stuck. Despite blatantly slipping off most of Jiraiya's ominous warnings, he did feel like he got a bite from them. With all the what-ifs that packaged themselves so nicely with the whole time-traveling debate, he usually didn't care much for them. There were always what-ifs, right? So what was the point in always dwelling on them? And then of course, there was the fact that most of those were going to come true one way or another. He's late. Again. Naruto paused in his loud rustling, craning his ears to hear the faint voices he could make out. Yeah, I know. Hey. If he never shows, wanna go get ramen with me? Never. Another scream. Actually, Sasuke-kun, would you like to know? A beat hadn't even passed. HN. Naruto blinked. Oh god. He knew exactly where he was. Exactly what time period he was in, and exactly what was going to happen. Immediately, he put a genjutsu on his appearance. A good one, because he didn't want Kakashi mysteriously popping in and whipping the Sharingan on him. The whiskers were gone, His hair was brown. That should be good enough. The man sighed, and Naruto was struck by how tired the man looked. Tired. And worn out. I'm not any younger, Naruto. I know. The blonde snorted. There's a reason the ladies avoid you. You're ruining the moment, brat. Sorry. He didn't sound it. As I was saying, Jiraiya coughed, and Naruto realized this was a long speech, so he began his work again. There's got to be someone experienced enough to lead the next generation in sealing. Not saying that you're not talented, Naruto, but you don't take enough precautions when you seal. I've never made a really horrible mistake. Naruto pointed out, even though he knew, seriously, that he was only prolonging the inevitable yet. And never will. He said, anyway. It's good you're optimistic. Jiraiya scoffed. But that's just wishful thinking. Looking up 17 translations into the fourth seal, Naruto was about to retort. He saw the look on Jiraiya's face and decided against it. Naruto knew that he was prying him open with just a look, cleaving through his thoughts by the mere movement of his eyes. Times like these Naruto cursed he didn't wear a mask like Kakashi. Jiraiya finally spoke. You're more of the person who's going to learn from their mistakes. Exactly. But you're not going to learn if you're dead. I'm not. Think of the odds, Naruto. Impossible is a word that will never belong in your vocabulary, but perhaps it's about time you put it there. I'll be fine. Naruto growled out. Sometimes, the lengths people went to when they were worried were so outrageous. Here. Check. The Sannin stood then, and Naruto took it as a wordless cue for the sage to do his own once over, and backed away slowly. To some degree, no matter how small or how little Naruto paid attention to it, he was aware of the dangers that began with just thinking about time travel, let alone doing it. Perhaps though, he just didn't want to admit it to himself. It wasn't like he was not cautious. Quite the opposite. The main seal, glowing azure in the center of his graph, was surprisingly perfect. The second, to the upper right, only needed one fixing. The third, which was the lower left, was also perfect. And the fourth, rearing the seal in the lower right-hand corner, only had one mistranslation. The seal faced counterclockwise. Clockwise, and he'd go into the future. It's good. Jiraiya said in his approval, after steadily looking it over for the past few minutes. He rummaged through his pockets, and Naruto watched him draw out a scroll sealed with wax with widened eyes. This is an anchor seal. Jiraiya began with seriousness, even though Naruto was well aware of what it was. Plant this in any certain point in time, and you'll be able to visit again if you add the translations into your main seal. Naruto was near jumping in anticipation. I'm warning you though, Naruto. This is a very important decision, and I'm only giving you one, so choose wisely. Dumbass. They walked out together, with a friendship that would hopefully transcend the time that Naruto was about to leap into. But Sakura sounded a bit too sad for just needless worry. She didn't actually think he'd just ditch her purposefully, did she? He wouldn't pull a Sasuke on her, even if her punches scared the living shit out of him. The hill was already prepared when Naruto trekked his way up there. Konoha was in the distance, its towers standing proud and tall even when circled with ominous forests. This was by far the tallest hill until the Iwa mountain range, a long distance away in the horizon. What a nice day, the blonde thought, and he hoped that whatever time he landed in would be experiencing the good fortunes of a warm front. Jiraiya was already waiting, cross-legged and stone-faced. His eyes were closed in what could be seen as deep meditation. Sadly, Jiraiya wasn't nice enough to do the seals for him. He decided that he wouldn't disturb the man, and began the first structure. It wasn't until he was fully done with the center graph did Jiraiya stir. Out of the other four that overlapped at its edges, forming a bit of a box, this was by far the hardest. Maybe it was the knowledge that this was the part that would let him travel amongst time or get him lost in a slipstream that scared him. His ink brush was nothing more than inches from the rice paper when Jiraiya's eyes snapped open. Watch where you put that thing. Holy fuck, you are too close to the second translation to be starting the second graph there. Naruto grinned sheepishly, looking up from his artwork. Right. The older man huffed, hands in the soft grass. Really, brat, how would you live without me? You'd be stuck in a slipstream if I hadn't opened my eyes. I'd check it over. Naruto rolled his eyes. Somehow I don't believe that. The Sandman replied. There was a silence webbed with anger and frustration from Naruto, and a calmer contemplative side from Jiraiya. The blonde worked in silence, goading the Sandman just to point out another mistake so he could yell back. But the Sandman was quiet all through his third graph. And even quiet through 3 translations through his fourth, until he opened his mouth. Naruto was ready to whirl on him. Good job. Naruto sputtered, noticing that even though he praised, Jiraiya wasn't happy in the slightest. It's a good job. The third graph. Naruto looked up from his work and eyed the man sitting a few feet away from him. But you don't look too happy about that. And it wouldn't be horrible to get to know his father a little bit, right? Sure, why not? I was a bit upset that I got more story alerts and author alerts than I did reviews. Review. And this, was his father? Jiraiya had eventually told him when he was halfway through theoretical time-traveling seals. He had said that one day, he may encounter his father, and ended up telling Naruto about his parents. And Naruto always wanted to know what they were like. Just very vague details, their hair color, their date of birth, nothing entirely special. Although he did say that his parents named him out of a character in Kukya, which was a bit weird. But no amount of facts could ever prepare him to seeing the man in person, standing in front of him. Yeah. Rin bounded up to her sensei. This man here has been gone for a while, so we were just filling him in on your position, Hokage-sama. Ga. Stop calling me that. Hokage-sama. Rin and Obito chirped. Hokage-sama. Kakashi scoffed from his place in the corner. Naruto waved. Nice to meet you, Hokage-sama. Stop. Minato groaned. The two were both quite blonde, though Naruto's had a darker shade, probably from his mother's red hair. His skin was darker as well, though that was most likely from years of travel. Their faces had a disturbing resemblance, the nose, the shape of the mouth and the chin. Minato had small, almost intense eyes, that seemed strange on his cheerful face. The eyes, though. Not their shape, but that brilliant everlasting shade of blue that could never be properly described, a color that mixed the ocean and the sky together, was what really completed the image. They were so alike, Naruto may as well have been looking in a mirror. Minato was thinking much the same. The blonde in front of him looked so much like him he was near reeling in the aftershock. Maybe a bit tanner, but he could use a little sun. And those cerulean eyes. That exact shade as his, though maybe brighter. Something tugged him toward the boy. Minato finished his once-over, a bit of suspicion in his smiling eyes. And you are? Just a jounin returning from a long mission. So many years away from home. Rin sighed. That must have been awful. Years? Minato echoed with shock. And then, with what may be understanding, were you part of Team Red? The Iwa reconnaissance team sent out all those years ago? Naruto could have wept for joy at the opening. One of the first to be deployed. Now that the tides have changed, they're sending a couple of us back. Minato eyed the blonde's bittersweet look. There was genuine relief in his voice. It must have been a long time, alone in a foreign country. He'd never had the first-hand experience of a spy, but he knew how difficult it was. We already finished our mission. There was nothing but sympathy in his voice. You can travel back with us if you like. Naruto blinked. Travel back to Konoha? Well, his rice paper was soggy, and he doubted that in this day and age his height would do him much good in Iwa either. And he could use some ramen. Time traveling seriously made him hungry. Plus, he was already halfway done with his ink. Ga. He'd go. Rin whirled on him with an embarrassed face. Don't ask stupid questions, Obito. Though this would be the perfect opportunity to spin his alibi. Well, actually, I've been out on a reconnaissance mission for quite a while, so it's probably natural you guys don't recognize me. They looked enraptured. You all were probably still in the academy when I left. Really? Asked Rin with wide eyes. How long? Around 5 years. Naruto shrugged, sounding nonchalant. They all erupted into confusing exclamations, sans Kakashi, who just kind of grunted, but even he seemed amazed. Wow, he totally looked like Sasuke leaning back on the tree like that, arms crossed and calm demeanor. A cross between Sasuke and Kakashi, Naruto didn't even want to think at this point. Although Kakashi at this age was really adorable, it might just be the soft plush white hair or maybe the way he thought he was the coolest thing in the world. It was a hard decision. That's so crazy. Obito cried with a grin. Then you must not know anything about Sensei's nomination. Naruto blinked, taken aback. What? Nomination? What time period was he in? Who's your sensei? Well, Minato-sensei isn't from a big clan or anything, but he's really amazing. Rin explained, her obvious adoration for her sensei tainting her view and bias. Sandaime-sama nominated him for 4th Hokage. Isn't that amazing? The group demeanor shifted almost immediately at the mention of their beloved sensei. Obviously the three looked up to him very much, and the mere mention of him had them all glowing in pride. Naruto digested the information with a sobering look that none of them seemed to catch. He'd never go far to say he disliked the Yondaime, for he really knew nothing about the guy. And Naruto was never a guy to judge a book by its cover. Though he'd certainly have a reason for any hatred he harbored for the man who was his father. And he certainly had no ties to the guy, even though he'd been told they were related. It was almost surreal to think that these kids looked up to him so much. Would that have been him, had his father survived? Would he not have this mixture of disgust and impassivity at the very thought of him? To Naruto, he was simply just another guy who did him no good. But he wouldn't let his prejudice involve itself with these kids. They were all watching his reaction, so he smiled softly. That's pretty cool. Isn't it? Rin gushed. That makes him the youngest in Konoha history. Not even the Shodaime was that young, only by a couple years. Kakashi interrupted snidely. And everyone loves him. He's the hero of this war. So they were in a war, then. Of course. Naruto could have smacked himself upside the head. The Yondaime was announced Hokage after the turning point of the Iwa War. Talking about me? I started sneezing. Naruto frowns. His voice wasn't anything he thought it would be. When he was younger, and he looked at his favorite Hokage on the mountain, he thought he'd have a stern voice, like when the old man was upset at his Anbu. But he didn't even have to see this man's face to know he was a unique, defined leader. It sounded laid back and a little higher pitched than he expected, much more like his own than he ever would have thought. This was the man who sealed the Kyuubi into him and pretty much made his life hell for 14 years. He didn't have time to guess. Actually, he barely had time to duck. A shuriken embedded itself in a tree behind him. Another one. A brown-haired girl, who couldn't possibly even come up to his chest, skidded to a halt after she had near tumbled out of the bramble. Leaves were stuck in her hair and she was breathing heavily. Naruto didn't have much time to fully assess her, as her right arm curved into an arch and 5 more kunai embedded himself into the trees behind him. He leapt out of the water and landed on the ground with little grace. Hey, whoa, stop that fuck. He ducked, swung around, and hopped over the rest of her shots, hands up in the air in what he assumed was universal surrender. Obviously not. I'm lost, I swear. He pleaded to her. Seriously. She blinked at him docilely, and for a moment he thought she'd lower her guard. Instead, her eyes hardened. I can't trust you. He'd have found the situation comical was he not so flabbergasted. There was something really confusing and disorienting about time travel, and he was still reeling from hopping through time and space, and really, was a few minutes of peace too much to ask? Lucky for him her throws were fairly weak and easy to dodge, and didn't take much effort on his part. She was a Konoha Kunoichi, judging from the headband, and could be anything higher than a newly minted chonin. Geez. Hadn't she noticed the exact same symbol on his headband? Yeah, Rin-chan, called a boy who gracelessly sprawled out of the bushes. Get him. He cheered. The last of the team was rustling through the bushes. You idiot. Look at his height. I ate. Naruto was about to kiss his feet for the first amount of common sense he'd had in the last 5 minutes, only to be met face to face with Kakashi. Naruto blinked. Well damn. Even at this age, he still wore his mask. Naruto had been looking forward to seeing a younger, maskless version of his sensei too. Oh my god. The girl Rin squeaked apologetically, hands flying to her mouth in a gasp. I'm so sorry. It's fine. Naruto grinned. No harm done. Well, looks like he wouldn't need a genjutsu. Probably wasn't even born yet from the looks of things. The three were quite a mismatched team, much like his own genin team. Kakashi was a dark, but small presence in the background, looking much younger than the rest of his team. The young girl had cropped brown hair that stuck straight, much unlike Sakura's wild mane. The last was an unruly-looking kid with jet black hair, and looked to be gravity-defying naturally. His goggles and chubby cheeks almost made Naruto think of himself. So you're Konoha nin? So cool. Where are you coming from? Did you have a mission in Iwa? The boy with orange goggles gushed, peering closer. Oh fuck. He could feel his genjutsu slipping, as he was putting more effort into the seal to control it. Kakashi noticed too, only visible eye narrowing as he lunged again. This time, however, Naruto leaned backward, another one of Kakashi's quirks. He could be such a lightweight, it was easy to spring him in another direction with enough leverage. Velocity always helped too, though. When Kakashi lunged, he leaned back and threw the man upwards. At the very least, the seal would activate and Kakashi would have no evidence except burnt rice paper. When Kakashi tumbled back onto the forest floor, the seal began to flare. Naruto waved happily. Oh, not to spoil it, but goes for new in the end. His sentence wasn't finished because the explosion of light was too loud and he had already disappeared. Kakashi was left to stare brokenly at the burnt rice paper, the sparks already devouring the only evidence of time travel. He woke up with his hair singed and near chakra exhaustion. At least, he sighed to himself, he wasn't going to have to worry about a stick shoved too close to his nose. In fact, the only thing he would need to know is that the surface below him was very wet. It was very, very cold outside, and he was bound to get sick. Regardless of Kyubaya or not. He imagined it to be early spring, perhaps from the way the trees that line the edge of the river were coloring nicely. It was definitely cold, but more of a crispness to the air than a frosty snap. From the sun no lazily descending into the tallest mountains, it'd have to be somewhere around 3. Well, if he was in water, it was always a good idea to see how deep it was. Twisting himself a bit, he swiped an arm below him, waiting to feel the swampy bottom when he hit something else. Soft fabric? With a concentrating frown on his face, he wedged whatever it was upwards. The fabric tugged onto something else and a whole bleeding torso came out of the water. Ah, shit. Naruto muttered, scanning as best he could the rest of the waters. Fairly clean, although there was definitely crimson streaking through it. Which meant a battle was taking place upstream. And from the looks of things, a rather gruesome one. Naruto let go of the torso it was already pulling him down anyway and used his chakra to sit atop the flowing water. He didn't spot anything particularly familiar, though he knew he shouldn't be too far. He fished himself out of the water, and began to walk upstream. Only with his rather sensitive hearing could he hear the battle taking place. The sharp clang of kunai, a small yelp, the sound of something gutting another person's sword maybe? And another yelp were just some of them. It sounded to be maybe, Chunin? Junin even? What were they doing here, boys? Minato grinned, diffusing the situation and what looked to be a sore point to the team. I'm happy to say I'm not entirely ancient. Didn't I tell you guys I was turning 22 soon? Team 7, of this day and age, went about with the information, Rin prattling on about something as Kakashi easily interrupted with sarcastic remarks. Naruto blinked as he absorbed the information. 22? That's it? He had maybe 3 years or so until the Kyuubi would be sealed within him. Or at least, if his calculations were correct from the fact that the Yondaime died around 25. Ah. Minato said as the conversation died down, leaning back to look into the sky. It's getting late, we should head out already. Naruto nodded, paying for his meal swiftly before Minato could protest. He had paid for all his students, including Obito's enormous amount, and Naruto didn't want to pressure him into paying anything more. "See you all at the inauguration?" He grinned at them. "Yep." Rin waved. "Better be there." Obito hollered over his shoulder. "Of course." Naruto shouted before they disappeared down the street. "Hokage-sama." And then belatedly, in the distance, "Ga." His mood sobered again. He and his father even had the same thing they said when they were caught off guard or annoyed. Another similarity to add to what seemed to be a forever growing list. He angled his face towards the sky, watching as the fading stars in the distance twinkled brightly against the dark twilight. "Minato's right," he sighed, though he was sure this wasn't what Minato had been thinking when he had said that. "I better get back." And there was the crux of the matter. Jiraiya had given him one anchor seal. Did he even want to put it here? The seal seemed to burn his retina with the intense light that accompanied each jump, and he spent a few moments blinking into a blurry sky. He hoisted himself up off of the anchor seal that was attached to the hill, congratulating himself on another successful time travel. He looked around, surprised that Jiraiya wasn't here. "No one's here to greet me?" His eyes traveled to the bottom of the hill, and then he realized why. The sleepiness that accompanied him onto each jump suddenly evaporated as he bolted onto his feet. "Sasuke." Naruto grinned and waved. "Yeah, just now. Hurry up." The Uchiha sprinted over with more vigor and personality than the two remaining Uchiha combined, sliding into a seat like home plate and immediately spewing a list of a variety of ramen flavors, most of which Naruto hadn't even been aware Kiraku made. Which said something, because Naruto had to be the most ramen-obsessed man in existence. Naruto grinned sheepishly. His diet had caved after spending tedious months with Jiraiya, who believed women a higher necessity than food. His stomach must have magically emptied itself again. Minato sighed with bemusement. "Why do I get the feeling I'm gonna be footing the bill? You're way richer than me." Obito pouted. "Honestly, how do you run so fast with all that change in your pocket? Trust me, after it's gone, you'll feel as light as a feather." "Obito." Rin scolded, though Minato had already started laughing. Naruto couldn't help but smile at their antics that, while immature, were almost refreshingly adorable. "You guys are idiots. And there's Kakashi." Minato smirked, as the boy moved into the stall like a wraith, seating himself silently between his two rambunctious teammates. The uneasiness that accompanied feeling so out of place slowly eased out of him, and he suddenly felt like a weight had been lifted off of his shoulders. It felt like coming home. Like being with his own Team 7 again, and maybe what it would feel like being with them now, if they could ever have the chance to be a whole team again. Minato had joined in some time ago, and the three were on a roll, the conversation always spinning into new angles. Maybe this would have been Team 7 if Sakura had lost her crush earlier in life, had Sasuke been more open to them, and had Naruto not been so obtuse. Watching them was like unraveling all the what-ifs in life. Obito stuck his tongue out. "I'm already 14. I've been 14. Rin retorted, stabbing her noodles with her chopsticks. "I turned 14 earlier this month." He pouted. "March 2nd. February." Obito pouted while Rin triumphantly stuck her tongue out. Minato blinked for a second, looking up from his two rambunctious students. "How old would you be, Naruto-san?" Naruto grinned. Well, 18 now, 19 in October. October 10th. Naruto elaborated. "That's 21 days away from Halloween." "Hey sensei." Rin leaned over the counter. "How old are you?" "Old." Kakashi scoffed. "Everyone's old to you." Obito countered. A fierce glare was shot at the loud Uchiha, who countered it with his own. The air seemed to chill as Rin started to attempt to ease the tension. Minato watched the blonde jounin plod down the street with no small amount of confusion. There was something particularly familiar about the blonde, though he couldn't think of what it could possibly be. Had he met him before? Why did everything he did, from rubbing his head to smiling at a joke, seem so familiar? He muttered to himself. It was probably just because the kid looked more like him than his own Kage Bunshin. Which was strange in itself. "Sensei." Kakashi called from the door, where he was still propping it open. "Are you coming?" Minato shook himself out of his reverie. "Yeah." Naruto sighed for the umpteenth time that day. Inflation made a decent hotel room the same amount as a carton of milk in the future, and Naruto had enough money to buy the best supplies and still have more than plenty for an outing of ramen. It was 10 to 1 when he finally found his way to the busy street where Ikiraku was. He hadn't realized he relied so heavily on the local businesses to find his way around until he was staring at unfamiliar street signs as if he was in Sunagakure. The most amusing part was seeing Ikiraku himself. The old man that Naruto remembered was nothing but a fresh-faced looking guy who couldn't be too much older than him, looking charmed by the thought of another customer. It was almost amusing to think of how famous Ikiraku would come to be in the future. "Naruto-san." He swiveled around in time to see a tall sunny blonde waving to him from across a distance of bustling people. Minato sure was a guy who stuck out in a crowd. "Minato-san." Naruto greeted, perhaps a bit too cordially. But he didn't know how else to. It wasn't like they were particularly close, that was to say if they were close at all. The older blonde grinned though, as if he'd known him his whole life. Or perhaps he was just obscenely friendly. "Where are the squirts?" "Dunno." Naruto shrugged, pretending to look at the menu like he had no idea what was on it. It hadn't changed in 20 years. "They haven't gotten here yet." "Ah, well, Obito's always late, although Rin's usually early." Minato muttered thoughtfully, then brightened. "But anyway, want to order already?" "Sure." They slipped into the bar stools. Minato checked the menu, while Naruto continued to pretend. Best to keep the alibi that he hadn't been in Konoha for a while instead of ordering right off the bat like he usually did. "One chicken miso ramen please," they said in unison, then turned to blink at each other. "That's your favorite?" Minato asked in surprise. It certainly wasn't the most liked flavor. Naruto nodded. "Yup. Ramen's always been one of my favorites." Logically, it made sense that he and his father would have the same taste in ramen. Though the event happening to him in real life was more surreal than he had first thought. "You already ordered?" Obito hollered from halfway across the street, Rin and Kakashi flanking him from behind. Minato, on the spot, blinked furiously. Naruto almost felt a little sympathy for the guy. It wasn't like he could just tell them that Jiraiya led one of the most intricate spy lines in the world, and was always leaving to get in contact with his informants. Well, he finds inspiration for his books. Minato decided upon. Rin seemed placated. Naruto chuckled. "What? Like spy on foreign bathhouses?" Obito busted into laughter, as Rin gasped dramatically, as if she hadn't the slightest idea that he did the same when he was home. Kakashi was coughing to hide his laughter. Minato smiled, and the two shared a knowing look. "Well, that's just disgusting." Rin huffed. "I can't believe he writes all those books and calls them literature. I can't believe he trained Sensei. That doesn't make any sense." "Sensei way cooler, Rin." Kakashi interrupted flatly, seeming to speak for the whole group at this point. "Shut up." She flushed. Rin meant well, but by God, she could talk. Forever. That, and her obvious devotion to her sensei seemed to make its appearance in almost every other sentence out of her mouth. Naruto almost held sympathy for the whole team, wondering how they managed to put up with her all the time. Then he remembered Sakura, and just felt sorry for himself. "Well, that wasn't very nice, Kakashi-kun." Minato berated with frown, though he looked the tiniest bit relieved. "But sensei," Kakashi blatantly pointed out. How his face could be one's exact feature was a bit disturbing. "We're already at the tower." "Ah." Minato nodded. He turned to look over to Naruto. "Do you need to turn in your mission report?" Shit. Excuse. Think. I'm actually really beat right now." Naruto grinned, rubbing the back of his head. "I just really want to sleep in my own bed right now, you know?" Minato's eyes softened. "I see. Oh. You're leaving already?" Rin pouted. "Will we see you soon?" Naruto blinked. "Yeah, sure. How about tomorrow we could all get some ramen?" At the mere mention of the food, Obito turned around abruptly, eyes wide. Ramen. He grinned. Hell yeah. Sounds like a great idea. Minato grinned. Apparently ramen was one thing shared equally by both father and son. Alright. Naruto nodded. Around 1? Sounds good. Rin cheered. Obito had already hopped up the stairs to the tower as Naruto began to wave goodbye, heading in the opposite direction. Before he even rounded the corner he was still thinking about supplies, where he was going to stay, and a whole other hidden agenda completely opposite to the front he'd just put up to his new friends. The Hokage mountain looked odd standing perilously against the backdrop of trees with only 4 heads decorating its face. Without Tsunade's massive forehead looked down upon the city Naruto couldn't quite call it home. Konoha really didn't age though, basking in what could possibly be immortal glory, a sort of feel to it that Naruto got even when walking through the gates 20 years in the future. Obito and Rin were conversing excitedly behind him as Minato chatted pleasantly with the guards. Geez, Naruto thought to himself, everyone was enamored with the blonde. It completely exceeded local hero, and was starting to enter local demigod phase. Everyone teased him lightheartedly about being inaugurated. Apparently, it was common knowledge that Minato detested being mentioned so formally. Throughout all the years, Naruto couldn't help but ease the strain out of his smile. Thinking about how quickly their pleasant lives would be cut short, he wasn't aware of any of them aside from Kakashi in the future made him exhausted. This cute little girl Rin, with her big brown eyes and chirpy laugh, would never live to see her 20th birthday. Neither would the boy, who reminded him so much of himself. I can't wait until the ceremony. Rin was saying eagerly. I wonder how many people will be there? Do you think there'll be a parade? Sensei, do you think we get to come up on stage with you? Of course not. Kakashi cut in with a frown, rolling his eyes. Minato laughed a little sheepishly. Well, probably not, Rin-chan. Kakashi-kun might be right, I am not sure. Oh. Rin pouted. Oh. Obito mimicked. She perked up though, swiveling to watch him with a curious expression that just seemed to naturally be on her face. Hey Naruto-san. Are you going to the ceremony? Naruto stilled visibly, before quickly reverting into an unreserved smile. Ah well. To be quite honest, he hadn't been expecting to have a particularly long stay in this time. But he'd be lying if he said Minato hadn't piqued his interest. Though he'd been in the man's presence for maybe 20 minutes, he felt himself drawing in for more. Everything about the man enraptured and surprised him. The way he tousled the back of his head, a familiar gesture which Naruto did himself frequently, the quirk of his lips when he was amused but not overtly so, his constant laughter. And would it really hurt to see his father become Hokage? That was one of the biggest historical moments of this generation, and while Naruto didn't care particularly for history, it was his father. Maybe at one point, back when just the mere mention of him even having a father had him captivated, the very thought would have had him jumping eagerly for a chance to go. But after finding out who the man really was, the man who sealed the greatest monster in the world into his son's stomach, a flawed, imperfect man, Naruto had lost most of his interest in the guy. And now, here he was, vacillating on the choice. Sure. He decided upon with a shrug. Lying to them now hardly mattered. Why not, right? There was a beat of silence, as if the three couldn't quite believe that Naruto would hold such little enthusiasm about it, until Obito laughed. Awesome. Rin agreed quickly. Kakashi just sort of looked put upon in the background. Luckily, the conversation took to safer ground, and Naruto quickly sighed in relief. The three and Kakashi occasionally had gone on to a lighter note of the weather, new shops that were opening up that spring, and the occasional bout into politics, what had the entire group divulging into their obviously clashing beliefs. And Naruto-san, you haven't even seen that ninja clothing store on 2nd Street, it's just amazing. But Jiraiya's perverted bookstore is just across the street from it. Oh. Do you even know what that is? That disgusting kuka? They didn't have that when you left. Did they? Well no. Naruto admitted, conscious of the eyes he knew were trained onto him. But I'm aware of who Jiraiya is, yes. Really? Rin tilted her head. That's surprising. I barely even know him. He's never around much. Always, well, doing whatever he does when he's not in Konoha. She turned to her sensei. Sensei, what does that pervert do when he's not here? She's right, dumbass. You can never have enough ramen. Obito rebutted sagely. Slow down, guys, Minato smiled sheepishly, coming between his students. Why don't we go out for tempura? We already had ramen this week, Obito. Maybe next time. It seemed to be a good decision. Naruto watched them head out, his mind wandering back to when he last had ramen. Sakura and Sai weren't as good of company as this Team 7, but he wasn't putting in effort to talk to them either. It felt odd now that they were fully grown. Kakashi was out on his own missions, Sasuke was over as Sound, and it was just them three. He felt a little guilty when he thought about how much he'd rather spend time here. Naruto. Minato called to him. Are you coming? Naruto blinked, touched. The four waited for him expectantly. Yeah. He smiled softly. Sure. Okay. Fine. You were there. Minato fought off his laughter with exasperation. Naruto only smirked at him. Naruto-san. Naruto. Obito sprinted over with his usual vigor, a bowl of ramen spilling as he went. Rin had tempura hanging out of her mouth, and Kakashi chose not to eat anything and still had his infuriating mask still in place. Though. There was teriyaki sauce on his cheek. Had Naruto missed it? Naruto felt his smile broaden. It was a great feeling watching the three come towards him. Sensei. Rin squealed. You looked so cool up there. Were you scared? Nah, Minato shook his head. I couldn't see anything. The stage lights were too bright. Hey. Now that you're Hokage and all, does this mean that we don't have to do any more missions? Obito grinned hopefully. Of course not. Minato frowned. We're going on another one tomorrow. Oh. What? HN. Naruto could have laughed at their reactions if he wasn't too busy doing so already. Sensei. Rin whined. I don't want another crappy D-ranked mission. Minato smiled cheekily. Who said it was D-ranked, huh? Obito and Rin brightened at the same time, screaming in joy as they dreamt of amazing action-packed A-class missions with evil ninja coming after them and becoming heroes while they were at it. Kakashi only grunted, arms folded over, only his eye betraying the evident pleasure he had at the news. Sounds like you guys are having fun. Naruto smiled. Minato turned to him. Are you planning to go back into the missions anytime soon? Nah, Naruto stretched, pulling off his lazy shinobi just back from a mission alibi. I think I'll stick around Konoha for a while. That's a good idea. Rin nodded. You should have a vacation or something. That might be a good idea, Rin-chan. I don't think Konoha will need me for a few months. Naruto commented vaguely, but no one caught the hidden meaning. They walked around for a little bit, running into people who were congratulating the new Hokage, who was blushing profusely with all the Hokage-sama that was going around now. Obito and Rin were laughing and playing games at the stalls with Kakashi, and occasionally Minato and Naruto would join in. But they were too good for the ring toss. They'd always get the ring in and they ended up with a lot of goldfish. Hey! Obito cried after the festival was dying down. Why don't we head out for some ramen? Obito. Rin growled. We just had some, there. No, green eyes. Over there. Not that one either. And with great pleasure and relief the audience chuckled, and Minato lost all the faces in the movement. May I please introduce our new Hokage, the Yondaime of Konoha, Namikaze Minato. He felt himself being tugged up the stage. He said a few words, smiled as best he could without faltering, reading his script. People he thanked, a rundown of his career, really the basics that everyone wanted to know but weren't really all that important. He supposed he might as well give up. It wasn't like it should mean anything to him, anyway. The Sandaime was here, looking at him with a wide, proud smile. Jiraiya was, somewhere, surely. Kushina was up in the front row clapping loudly, and his team may as well have been the loudest of them all, way in the back jumping up and down. All his important people were here, friends from his Genin graduation all the way up to the Jounin he had met on a few missions back. Yet the bitter feeling was there, anyway. The Sandame graciously took the mic away from him before he could make a proper fool out of himself, and wrapped up the speech in a couple of minutes. Minato shifted his weight, antsy for the onslaught of people that would no doubt greet him with more vigor than they ever had before. And they did. Hordes of people came to congratulate him, and he welcomed them half-heartedly. Kushina had given him some ecstatic backclapping, which had cheered him up some, and Kakashi had for once in his life actually shared food with him. But there was no Naruto in sight. If he had a son, he would have said it hurt as painfully as him not going. Eventually the crowd thinned around him, and he was left to breath in the crisp night air in blessed silence. The noise faded, and he took the moment to relax in the slight reprieve from all the people. Hey! Congrats! He turned around. And there he was. Smiling at him. I thought you weren't going to make it. He smiled back, relieved. Whatever bitterness was lost completely at the sight of the other blonde. Naruto shrugged. Ah. I got a little lost. You see, this black cat crossed my path and then I had to win in doubt, use one of Kakashi's many excuses. Little lost? Minato grunted. Very lost. The inauguration's already over. Naruto pouted indignantly. I made it once you had gotten your speech. Okay, a lie. He had barely just stumbled out of his own seal. Really? The newly made Yondaime seemed skeptical. Then surely you'd remember my opening lines, right? Luckily, the academy had him prepared with all those useless history tests they used to do that had little to no relevance with being a ninja. Memorizing the Yondaime's inauguration speech was one of them. Or so Naruto had thought. Until now. He coughed. To my fellow citizens of Konoha, I am thankful for the position and honored that out of the many attachment, Naruto, is a very dangerous thing. Jiraiya lectured seriously, before his eyes went very distant as he watched himself in the reflection of his tea. It leads you to do very stupid things. To change things that shouldn't be changed. By even having a passing interest you threaten the very balance of history. Naruto gulped, though he had no words to reply with. He was well aware that what he had done was stupid. He was well aware that his intentions when placing the anchor seal weren't for study, they were for himself. He knew all of this, yet he couldn't take it back. Jiraiya watched him with hooded eyes. But you don't care, do you? The Konoha streets were bursting with a magnitude of colors, from the striped hoods of street vendor stalls to the enormous balloons that took to the sky, everything had a color. And the noise. It was quite possible that there wasn't a single soul who wasn't engaged in excited chatter. Minato seemed to be the apple of everyone's eye for the evening. The thought made him a bit nervous. He could make out Obito's wild spikes from his spot backstage, a bit amused by the enormous takoyaki the boy was tackling, two in each hand. The inauguration hadn't even started, yet his knee was bouncing anxiously. The three of them mingled over to another stall, this one a fish-catching stall that had Rin delighted. Minato wished he could join them, but alas, he had a job to fulfill. It seemed that the entire country had come up to congratulate him, some boisterously and some even with tears in their eyes. Minato was a bit flabbergasted by it all, but mostly he was really humbled. Pleased, even. It seemed there wasn't a soul in Konoha who hadn't taken his inauguration with ill thoughts. He may be the first Hokage after the Shodaime to have that happen, or so said Hiruzen. Though a thought lingered in the back of his mind. He was recalling a silly blonde with a wide, but enigmatic smile and the brightest blue eyes that resembled his own so much he may as well have been looking in a mirror. He'd said he'd be here. So where was he? He'd looked truthful when he'd promised to come, and Minato wanted to readily believe him. As much as he wouldn't want to admit it, he was actually a bit hurt by the no-show. That in itself was bizarre to him. It wasn't like Naruto was important to him. He'd met him only a day ago, and yet there was a certain deep feeling which stirred at the mere thought of him, and it hurt, almost like a brief nostalgia which stung the back of his nose. He smiled, and Minato felt pleased. He had to protect that smile. It felt like Naruto was one of his own. It had only taken eye contact. He wondered if it had something to do with their similarities. Hell, even their voices were the same. The Sandame had begun his introduction, and the guests were beginning to gather towards the stage. Minato was worried now. The inauguration was already starting. Where was he? He tried to scan the crowd as best he could, but he certainly wasn't the only one who was blonde, and there was a sea of people. Jiraya's hands, that were in his sleeves, unfolded, and a small slip of paper with the tracking seal was on it. This seal. Yes. In another time period. Another gulp. Yeah. Jiraya's eyes narrowed. And you're sure about this? He'd been given the opportunity, so certainly Jiraiya wasn't mad about that. He held his gaze. Yes. Jiraiya sighed. You've only done 2 jumps, Naruto. I told you to choose wisely. I have. Naruto interrupted. And you never told me I had to anchor to a specific time. I could choose whenever I wanted, right? Though I'd prefer if you had spent more time branching out. Jiraiya gave him a hard look. Naruto attempted to meet it, but failed. But it is your choice. Naruto nodded. And you're sure? No, not at all. He had never had any intention about meeting his father when they began this whole endeavor. Sure, it had settled as a thought in the back of his mind, but the actual event had changed his perspective. Made him curious. Interested. Yes. Made him long for something he thought he'd stopped wanting a long time ago. Jiraiya tutted. I think you should rethink this. What? Naruto blinked, in shock. Was Jiraiya serious? You need time before you start properly engaging at other times. Jiraiya tented his fingers. I think you need some more experience with the whole jumping process. All you have to do is burn the anchor seal, jump back to this time, and you'll be free to go as you please once more. Once more? Naruto repeated in disbelief. But I don't want that. You said I could place the seal anywhere. Maybe that was a bit rash of me. Jiraiya mused. I should have known you'd be too eager to do so. You're wasting a lot of opportunities by doing so, Naruto. That doesn't matter to me. Naruto insisted, belatedly realizing he was shaking the table. I know. Jiraiya nodded. I'm not stupid, Naruto. I know who you've met. You. His eyes widened in shock. How? I know you. He said as explanation. It's never particularly mattered to you before, certainly not after I told you about him. But remember, I know you, and I know Minato. It was only natural that you'd want to get to know him. He's a supreme leader. And your father. If you hadn't wanted to get to know him, I'd be a bit surprised. Then I don't get it. Naruto furrowed his brows in annoyance. What's the problem? Temporarily, at least. After Sasuke left, Naruto breathed a sigh of relief. He was too close to exhaustion to deal with Sasuke now. Naruto. Sakura called softly once the Uchiha's presence was long gone. Sai, however, wasn't as keen to dancing around this subject as Sakura was. It was you who was making all those chakra flares, wasn't it? He couldn't lie, but he did avert his eyes. Sakura sighed, and it didn't sound very relieved. He really hoped she wasn't crying. He hated it when she did that. It made him always feel guilty. I know you can't tell me. She sighed, the undertones of sadness in the submissiveness of her tone. I'm sorry guys. Naruto felt more out of place in his own time than he did in the other. It's just I really can't tell you. Can't, or won't? He didn't know himself. Classified. Sai offered. Yeah. The last vestiges of Team 7 settled into a very uneasy silence. Sakura had her hands behind her back, twiddling with her fingers with unanswered questions. Sai stood a bit to her right, his feet on the base of the hill's long slope, eyes and body posture betraying nothing of what he was feeling. Naruto watched them from a little ways above them on the hill, the wind rolling the grass and sending his hair in which way directions. Sakura sent him a very melancholic smile, but a smile nonetheless. Are you coming back with us? He actually wasn't very sure. I guess so. Then we'll go for ramen. She announced, looking sure of herself. There was a tinge to her voice though, as if she was unsure if even ramen could bring Naruto around. Her fears were unfounded, though. Yeah. He agreed. However, this time, with this Team 7 there was no one to begin the banter that had existed between the one he was currently wavering around. After ramen, Jiraiya had asked for him. The tea house was a very small one that was atop a beauty parlor that existed on the first floor. Tsunade was currently getting a nice massage, and since Jiraiya was accompanying her for whatever reason, their meeting took place on the next floor up. Jiraiya folded his arms silently as they sat across the table. The small tea house was filled with quaint music and very little people. The seal master had a very stern look on his face, and Naruto had bowed his head, trying not to seem intimidated even if he was. It was scary watching Jiraiya like this. He was much too used to the pervert's light-hearted tendency when they were around women. However now, when dealing with sealing, he was a much more opposing figure. "You put a seal," he stated. It wasn't a question. He gulped nervously. Yeah. They'd picked the hill because it was strategic all in the middle of nowhere. The forest around it was dense enough that it clouded the view from all around, and the slope was small enough that, while providing a good view, didn't stick out obtusely. The disadvantage was that it was equally as close to the Valley of the End, and inevitably, Odagakure as well. "Sasuke," he whispered, making out the boy's dark spikes from the distance. Sakura was speaking, and Sai was a bit behind her. Sasuke's odd arrangement of teammates were in a semicircle behind him, and though they looked slightly imposing, Naruto got the impression that he wasn't here for a battle. If he was here for anything at all. Naruto was under the impression that Sasuke had no free will at this point. Naruto had been so astounded by meeting his father, he was still basking in the dreamlike experience he'd just arrived from, and seeing Sasuke, standing with that team that looked so disturbing behind him, though that may be because anyone who stood next to him that wasn't Team 7 looked wrong, sent that fake reality crumbling into the real one he'd left behind. But there was no use holding the dream, even as it crumbled into dust. "Hey!" he shouted, and the entire party turned their heads. "Ms. Miette?" He'd been so caught up in this world that seemed so different from his own fragmented one, that he'd almost forgotten about the man who used to be his best friend. "Naruto." Sakura breathed a sigh of relief. The blonde looked oddly relaxed, uninterested, or perhaps just unimpressed. There had been a time when, at the mere sighting of Sasuke, Naruto would have leapt immediately into action, pleading for the boy to come back. Now though, he only stared silently with eerily blue eyes. "Great to see that Dickless made it," Saya praised with a blank smile. Naruto, and everyone else for that matter, still could not tell the difference between his seriousness and his satire. Naruto frowned in jest. Naturally Sai, only the most sexually inactive can see the humor in that. The black-haired boy blinked. Sakura tisked at the duo's immaturity, though her lips had curved into an amused smirk. Naruto caught Sasuke's eyes from across the tense clearing, almost absurdly pleased to find a flicker of something passing through their dark depths at the exchange. Was he upset to find himself replaced? The dark-haired boy appraised them all with his hooded, near-impassive gaze. Naruto would have never been able to tell the difference had he not encountered a younger Kakashi who had the stoic stone-like face down to utter perfection, so much so he made Sasuke look like a novice. He looked like he was searching them all for something, a deep silence resounding as none of his teammates made a sound. He seemed to come to a conclusion. "It's not them." He spoke voice that still lingered in his memories, though was to his teammates. The redhead one blinked at his leader. "You're sure?" Naruto met Sasuke's eyes, two different sides to the same sky. "Yes," came Sasuke's frank reply. Naruto blinked, before his eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You're investigating?" The Uchiha didn't seem to think Naruto was worth a reply, tearing his midnight eyes away from the blonde. He turned his back to his former team, looking like he was about to head out. "It's not any of them." He looked over his shoulder, as if goading any of them to say otherwise. Naruto held his gaze, before turning away. "Of course not," he said eventually, nonchalance catching Sasuke off guard. "Go tell your master that whatever it was wasn't coming from us. And if it's in our borders, we can deal with it ourselves." If that wasn't a dismissal nothing else was, and Sasuke only turned around and continued to walk into the shadows of the forest, the only way Naruto could see his anger in the burning afterglow of his eyes. Naruto would have thought more of the dark-haired boy, Had he not been so concerned over what the boy's purpose was? Maybe the snake was trying to keep peace and was simply checking to see if things were amiss? Or perhaps, and more likely, he was trying to see if this energy could be harnessed for his own gain. Either way, crisis averted. "Sensei!" she screamed, but it was too late. He hadn't aimed for the head, which would have caught Minato's attention quicker when at his eye level, but at the leg. The blow wasn't critical, but it was enough to cripple the use of Hirashi. Minato recoiled in shock as he realized he'd been hit, sending shuriken to the nin that had hit him. The man was dead, but he had gotten the winning hit. "Sensei!" Rin gasped, fear welling in her stomach. He pulled the kunai out of his leg with a wince, dispatching Kage Bunshin to stall the enemies. Rin rushed to her sensei, quickly trying to heal the wound. It had cut deep, cutting a few tendons and horrendously close to the bone. As Rin worked furiously with the chakra she had left, tears brimming her eyes, she realized she wouldn't be able to heal it enough. It'd take at least a day or so until Minato could walk upright, let alone fight an outnumbered battle and use Hirashi. "How does it look, Rin?" he asked hoarsely, watching the battle and throwing kunai when it seemed appropriate. She shook her head. "I can close it, but you won't be able to move it a lot." Her sensei hissed under his breath, in what may have been a curse. Her other two teammates looked up from their battle. "Sensei!" called Obito worriedly, in the midst of a Katen jutsu. "Look out, idiot!" Rin screamed at him. He quickly turned back to his battle, catching one of the shinobi which had dodged his fireball at an awkward angle with his blade. Kakashi scowled at him, as he struck for his teammate and dispatched the enemy. The three others dropped from their trees and the 10 or so Kakashi was fighting came closer. 13 on 2, the odds didn't look very good. Rin turned her attention back to her own fight, where her sensei had sent Ototan into the fray. "Rin!" Minato gasped, hitching himself onto one leg, and attempting to get a feel for the other. "Get out of here! You, Obito, and Kakashi!" Rin blinked at him, eyes wide. "Why, you're serious?" She studied his expression, before exploding. "No way. I won't leave. I'm not going to leave you here knowing you won't make it back." The fourth Hokage gave her an exasperated, but morbid look. "Rin, I'm not leaving," she insisted. "And I know that Obito and Kakashi would never, ever abandon you in battle either. This has nothing to do with deserting your comrades." Minato breathed heavily. "This is for your safety. I should have brought you guys out here. It was too soon. This isn't your fault," said Rin, shock furrowing her brows. "How could you think this is your fault? Sensei, we're not going to leave you here. We'll fight it out and figure something out." "Rin, I'm not leaving," she interrupted, shouting. The fourth frowned, but his student was dead set. There wasn't even a logical reason to be worried. Minato wasn't considered one of the strongest shinobi in the world for no reason, and he already had a reputation for scaring the shit out of the Iwanin with his name only. And while certainly Kakashi wasn't the 1000 copy nin, he wasn't useless. And Rin and Obito, well, they definitely didn't suck, that was for sure. And yet, even so, ever since he had chased down Sasuke, he hadn't held this much fear in his heart as he did now. Rin whipped her head around. "Sensei! Watch out!" The kunai missed its mark, and Rin breathed a sigh of relief. She shouldn't have been so tense, it was Minato-sensei after all, but they'd been fighting for a long time now, and if exhaustion was getting to her, who ran at a normal human speed, she couldn't imagine how it felt to him, who ran at a rate 10 times as fast. She dispatched her enemy with a swift blow to the back of the head, trying to listen to the sounds of Kakashi and Obito fighting a distance away over the sound of her fiercely beating heart. When had that guy left for reinforcements? Like, an hour ago? Rin was cursing that idiot's slowness, and for that matter, his useless team who hadn't done much aside from divert the enemy's attention. She didn't know where they were, though she suspected their whereabouts were somewhere on the ground. "I'm fine, Rin-chan." Minato gave an exhausted little smile, before sending a flurry of kunai whipping past her and into the enemy lines, so fast she couldn't even make them out as they slid past her. It had been an ambush. Apparently, the Iwanin had already got wind of Sensei's inauguration. Minato wouldn't be starting office until a few more weeks because the Sandame still had much to do before he retired, but it had already been stated that when he did step down, Minato would take his place. How'd they know so fast, sensei? She panted under her breath. I don't know. He sighed to her. But it really wasn't much of a secret. Back in the war, there had been flee on-site orders at the very name of Namake's Minato. When they'd gotten such a backbone, Rin didn't know, but they certainly weren't keeping to those orders. Team 7 had been on what was supposed to be a regular C-class retrieval mission, only to find the Konoha they were supposed to get the scroll off of murdered, with a small legion of Iwanin in their wake. Looping two three-pronged kunai in his fingers, Minato flicked them into the crowd. Without another look at his student, his hierarchy was tearing up their numbers. Rin watched in astonishment. She could never get over the awe she had at her sensei's speed. Just like the rumors, she could only catch a faint blur of yellow before it was gone completely, leaving nothing but butchered bodies in its wake. The numbers were dropping steadily, but not at a pace that they could keep for long. The four were holding out for reinforcements. There was no other alternative, aside from taking their chances at fleeing. How were they supposed to win this? She thought worriedly. Even with Sensei, who was crushing through their numbers, the odds still seemed slim. Minato finally skidded to a halt, breathing labored. The Iwanin were regrouping, and a slight standstill gave both sides a chance to recover strength. It was then she saw it. From the opposite side of the field, one of the bodies on the ground had begun to stir. There was a glimmer of metal, and then he wandered aimlessly around the streets, unsure of what to do, in which he had so little problems. There were no personal issues to resolve, to Sasuke looming in the forever distant horizon, no Sakura to watch him with those heartbreaking eyes. And perhaps that wasn't a bad thing. He certainly didn't want to go back yet. His time felt like a far-off dream, some sort of scattered memory he could hazily recall, but mostly didn't want to. He didn't want to admit it, but maybe he liked it better here in the past. He couldn't remember the last time he had been so jovial, so carefree. And then, of course, there was Namake's Minato, one of the key points in his life to his existence that didn't even know he was one yet. What the ahmagad? Eek. Get out of here, you pervert. Naruto looked up. With a smack that could have rattled the surface of the planet, Jiraiya went flying out of the bushes, only to roll lifelessly onto the pavement. A couple people around stopped to gasp and point scandalously. The old pervert himself didn't seem to have changed much. He was still, well, old, with a mane of gray hair, and obviously a lecherous streak a mile wide. The Sannin jumped to his feet as if he was quite used to this treatment, and barreled right past him, as did the angered women who followed soon after. Naruto smiled. Some things never changed. The street the bathhouse was located on exited out to the western gate, the large walls looking as if they hadn't aged at all. Naruto wondered if there was even anything powerful enough to take them down. Orochimaru's snakes at the Chunin exams had only crumbled a bit of them, but the whole thing? Was there a jutsu that existed that could do that? Maybe, but Naruto had no intentions of facing it down. Two Chunin were lounging near the edges of the large opening, and Naruto didn't envy them standing in the midday sweltering heat on guard duty. He'd missed it with his automatic promotion, luckily. He was halfway to the other side when another Chunin flew out of the forest, looking completely out of breath. There's trouble on the western border. The man gasped, bending onto his knees. The three on guard duty stood to attention. What? Were you on patrol? Which squadron? Red Squad. The man panted. And yeah, we were. It's the team dispatched earlier this morning with Hokage-sama. At this, the air seemed to still as the assembled group quickly realized how serious the situation may be. They were near the Iwa border. Around the Valley of the End it was an ambush. My team's out helping them. But they need reinforcements. Aye, he took a shuddering breath. I came as fast as I could, but I will send a team out immediately. Kota, contact HQ and get an Enbu squad over there ASAP. Naruto blinked. Iwa? Hokage? He didn't bother to hear the rest of the conversation. He dropped his leftovers from Mikiraku, patted himself down to make sure he was fully equipped, took 2 steps and then flew into the trees before the Chonin could even notice. He was well acquainted with the long and grueling path to the Valley of the End, and, just like when he'd made it all those years ago, it was still nerve-wracking and filled with anxious impatience. Naruto wasn't sure why each step felt like it was 10 years too slow, why it even really mattered to him, especially when he'd just been musing as to how little he cared for his father, and yet here he was, bolting out into the middle of the forest after him. Though Naruto had had no words to tell him. "I'm just not interested." The at the time Chonin had shrugged. Was he blonde? Yes. Yes he was. Blue-eyed? Yes. And my mother? Kushina? Oh, she had this fiery red hair. Blue eyes too, but they were lighter, more green. Huh. That's it? Jiraiya had blinked in disbelief. No reasons? No. Why? Do you even care at all? Not really, no. He couldn't not when these people had given him up to the demon ready to destroy the world. And maybe he was being a bit obtuse, and maybe a bit stubborn. But honestly, when it came down to it, he didn't want to know them. To understand them. Not when the betrayal stung so much. You know, he did what he had to. Jiraiya began, anyway. There was nothing that could stop the Kyuubi no summon, no jutsu. That your father could even come up with a way to somehow stop it was a stroke of genius in itself. He was a great man, Naruto. A fantastic leader and an honorable person. He'd have wanted to know you, he'd have been so proud of you, honestly, Jiraiya. Naruto sighed. It's fine. Can we stop talking about this? Jiraiya watched him carefully with saddened eyes, as if it hurt to know that his student's living legacy held his own father in so little disregard. If that's what you want. Of course, meeting the man in person changed his perspective. Naruto mused over his ramen. Though he hadn't quite thought of him as his father in anything more than vague interest in the obvious genetic inheritance he'd received, he could admit personally to himself that Jiraiya was right, he wasn't a bad man. Obviously it wasn't intentional to make the first 10 years of Naruto's life a brutal uphill struggle. Maybe he'd even felt some ounce of regret, sealing that monster into his own kid. The most ironic part was, Minato even seemed to like him. Perhaps the one person in the entire world who held Minato in a flat, impassive regard was the one person that Minato seemed the most charitable to. He'd insisted on Naruto coming to dinner with them, and joining them around the stalls. And while the younger blonde certainly hadn't protested, Naruto wouldn't quite call it an outing he was enthused over. He loved Team 7 though, that was for sure. Everything about Obito had him amused. Everything about Rin had him smiling. Even Kakashi, who generally made an ass out of himself and tried to keep to himself, had Naruto attempting to draw him out. Perhaps Jiraiya was wrong. Maybe anchoring to this time hadn't been such a bad idea after all. It was certainly a learning experience. And wasn't what the old man always preached about? Thanks for the food. Naruto smiled to Tuki as he paid for his ramen. The man waved as he left. Naruto awoke to a dizzying headache, which already set him into a foul mood. And he had accidentally crashed in a tree instead of just renting a hotel. Normal sane people. Sane people didn't include ninja though, for Naruto knew more than a few of them who had sprawled onto the local foliage on more than one occasion. Though they were practical to a degree, trees were generally, well, hard with rough bark, and didn't make for the most pleasant of beds. And there was no complimentary soap. But there wasn't a hotel in the world which could fully capture the beauty of waking up in the morning on the loftiest branch to the sun peelings its way into a navy sky. Just look at it. Made a brief moment in which Naruto forgot all his troubles, stretched out on one of the highest branches, just swaying with the wind. He had to get down eventually, though, before the bees came out of the nest above him. Minato had something about leaving to take his now more experienced team onto a higher-classed mission. It was quite close to the inauguration, which happened a day prior, but Minato was, well, Minato, and he was going to be needed just as much today as every other day. The world always seemed to need him. He leapt off the branch and landed on the ground far below, cracking his knees in the process with a satisfying crick. The morning was perfect for a lazy wandering around town, without people stopping to glare at him. Or maybe he was just having too much fun pretending he was incognito all the time. Still, taking a stroll without glares or crude remarks was nice, and in fact, most of the people seemed rather nice to him. And some looked at him curiously. Maybe it was just his disturbing similarity to the fourth. Speaking of the yandame, without him around, the past seemed exactly like the present. People didn't really change. Perhaps the style was a bit different 20 years in the past, but civilians were still civilians and ninja were still ninja, and therefore little about Konoha was different. In fact, Naruto was getting a bit bored. His steps were leisurely, and he made his way around with no particular destination in mind. He ended up with a stroll completely through town, seeing little kids run by him he was sure he'd met in the future as his older peers, a just-opened bookshop dedicated solely to Jireya's literary works of art, and stores that he'd never seen before that had closed down before he ever got the chance to peruse them. Speaking of those so-called literary art, Naruto really had to wonder, did Kakashi read them yet? If so, he was one perverted young boy, who would grow to be a super pervert old man. It was natural as Uzumaki Naruto that eventually he'd find himself seated in one of the stools at Hikaraku, even though he'd never made the decision to go there. Ah, his subconscious. Always a step ahead of him. "Can I get anything for you?" a young Tuki asked him. Naruto was disturbed to see him without wrinkles. "Just a miso ramen, please." "Alright, coming right up." Ramen in the morning always smelled the best. Naruto smiled ruefully. Soon it wouldn't be just Tuki alone in the back preparing food. A young, chirpy Yam would soon join him. Naruto wondered what Tuki would think if he told him. Would he be surprised? Probably not. Maybe loving to cook ramen was genetic, just like loving to eat ramen. They were such a good parent-child pair. Naruto had always wondered if he'd be as good with his father if his father had been alive. There was a time when he doubted it. He hadn't been particularly enamored with the thought of his father after he'd found out who he really was. There'd even been a time when Naruto had wanted so badly for his father to be the yandame, the hero of Konoha, which they learned so much about at the academy. If his father was the fourth Hokage, no one would make fun of him and certainly not push him around. But after finding out it was the yandame who'd done this to him, and in turn, that the man was his father, he lost most of his fascination, until it only became a distant curiosity. Jiraiya had argued the man's case to Naruto before, though the blonde had never listened particularly. "It's not like you to care so little," Jiraiya had frowned sternly. "What is it?" he whispered. The Sandame shook his head. "I haven't the slightest idea." Minato leaned closer, watching the seal pulse, fade, and then pulse again. Soon, his hand was nearing the seal, the swirl in the middle that seemed so oddly familiar. He was close, about to touch it when "Don't touch it." The voice was deep and low, almost a growl. Minato retracted his hand immediately, standing upright and staring down with surprise into Naruto's face. There was something burning fear in his eyes, which weren't the blue they normally were, but a deep Prussian with pupils that looked like pinpricks. It had been 4 days or so, and Minato hadn't exactly been confined to bed rest, but he certainly wasn't allowed to leave. Which was fine by him, because all he did for the past 3 days was sit in Naruto's hospital room, hearing the monotonous machine and watching the pale form that still didn't have the flush of color from health. "Minato-kun?" The voice of the third Hokage startled him, as he sat upright in the chair he had been slouching in. "Sandame-sama." Minato blinked in surprise. "Why, you're here? You gave me quite the scare when I heard you had been injured. I can't imagine another 20 years with all that paperwork." Sandame smiled. "How are you?" Minato shook his head. "I'm fine, just. Have you heard anything from the doctors?" "It's just chakra exhaustion," the Sandame informed patiently. "Except that Naruto-san has extremely enormous chakra reserves, about 4 times that of normal shinobi. For the past couple days before this incident, he was working on low reserves." "Low reserves?" Naruto had seemed fine. "Why is that, Hokage-sama?" The Sandame chucked at the Hokage part, but continued nonetheless. "I don't know exactly, but whatever he had done was extremely hard on his reserves, and was something that most humans could not attempt. His eyes traveled to the sleeping boy. The doctors say he will wake up soon, and I must say I'm grateful. There's much to be learned from him. Minato blinked. Like what? The smile that the Hokage gave him was a very odd one. Minato-kun, have you ever thought of children? To say the yondaime was startled would be an understatement. What? The Hokage as of present shook his head. Ah, never mind. He strode closer to Naruto, until he was right next to his bed, standing above him. There are many things we need to discuss with him. The Sandaime said eventually, his voice carrying an odd tone. There are things that we will only find out from he himself. And nothing with tests and medicine will do much for our questions. The fourth to be didn't know much about what the Sandaime was saying, but he nodded anyways. Carefully, Sarutobi pushed back the covers. Minato got up too, more or less to see what exactly the third Hokage was doing. Naruto had bandages running up his right arm. Even then there were times when the burns could be seen, sweltering red against his tan skin. The boy looked so much younger as he lay still on the sheets, nothing more than breath rattling in him that kept him looking alive. The third pushed up Naruto's hospital shirt very slowly, as to not wake the boy. There. Minato leaned in closer, eyes widening at what he saw. It pulsed in time to the boy's heartbeat, the black kanji fading into his skin before returning with much vigor, almost as if it lifted above the boy's skin and into translucent tendrils above him. It was magnificent, like looking at a work of art that was so rare that it awed everyone that had ever seen it. This seal could be considered a work of art. Minato had never seen anything like it. Ever. Jiraiya would be impressed if he saw the intricacy of such a seal. Ugh, stupid seal, wasting my chakra. It sounded like a bunch of gibberish, so Minato brushed it off. Naruto, we're going to take you back to the hospital, okay? Naruto. The boy had stopped mumbling, slipping into the unconsciousness that could only be chakra exhaustion. Minato-sensei. Obito called as he ran up into the clearing, looking frightened by the carnage. He gave a furtive, worried, and perhaps even frightened, look to Naruto. What happened? Kakashi jogged up behind him, and Minato was relieved to see them both okay. He coughed, attempting to keep himself conscious for a little while longer. Naruto-sensei. Kakashi's voice was cold as he spoke, but his eyes spoke volumes. That fire. And that move. He looked alarmed. What was that? Minato shook his head. Don't know. To be honest, Obito began, looking just as bothered as Kakashi. I thought it sort of looked like the Rasengan. Rasengan? Kakashi echoed. He looked at Minato. Sensei, isn't that your technique? Yeah. The fourth breathed. Obito was watching Naruto with a discomforted expression, as if he wasn't sure what to make of him. Uchihas were born into fire. The Gokyu was a testimony to an Uchiha's strength. But that had been like standing in an inferno, some sort of inhuman sun scorching in front of him. His face still felt, even as the wind had snuffed all the fire out. The yondaime couldn't blame him. It was mind-blowing, even to Minato. Let's get back, he said eventually, picking up Naruto's limp form. We've got to get to a hospital. His team couldn't help but agree. The only thing establishing dreams from reality was the steady, slow beeping of Naruto's monitor some feet away from him. Minato didn't remember how long he'd been there, and usually the noise would have agitated him. But he welcomed it now. It meant that Naruto was still alive. It was strange though, to see his face unmarred in false sleep, the dark lashes and the curve of his nose which seemed so familiar. It looked quite a bit like Minato's, but his was more straight in the middle while Naruto's had a more feminine curve. Probably his mother's nose. Why Minato was musing on Naruto's genetic features was beyond him, but probably had something to do with the fact they were so similar to his own. But to be honest, Minato was almost relieved Naruto wasn't awake. What would he say if he was? It was gone. The fire seemed to crumble out of existence as wind rattled past her, stealing her breath and gathering it to the center where a maelstrom took the place of what was once an ocean of flames. The fire burned out with the wind that took its place. And then, nothing. She collapsed into darkness. Minato had not, though. He had a clear shot of the destruction, trees splintering with the wind, the flames snuffed out as his breath was stolen, saw the wind tighten into a man's palm, a perfect azure sphere, spinning with the power of a hurricane, whipping the charred landscape with stinging wind that lapped at the edges of the field. Was that? It couldn't be. Not the Rasengan. All he'd have were memories to study, because it was gone before he could fully inspect it. But he could never mistake his original technique. There wasn't any other kind like it in the world. So then, what was that? The burned foliage had been shredded as if stretched by a tornado, the grass uprooted into scars of dirt and the roasted body smoldered. But Minato wasn't remotely bothered by all of this. What disturbed him was the shock of lemon-colored hair he could see from here, on a man that seemed to have a perturbing like Naruto. He called out into the scorched earth, and he could have sworn that back had stiffened. Naruto. Minato blinked. He couldn't tell from his place pushed back by the wind, squinting through it, to see that Naruto's eyes were bloodshot red. Or that his hands were claws. All he knew was that Naruto who said he was nothing more than a barely passing jounin who had come back from a tiring reconnaissance mission, who smiled with him and his team, who he cared for had just used his ultimate technique. One he made up, and one that no one else in the entire world would ever know about. And he had used it better than he could have. Suddenly, from his distance Minato could see Naruto's eyes flutter closed, as he dropped onto the ground in one swift motion. Naruto. Despite his injuries, Minato ran to the boy, who was breathing heavy, collapsed on him amidst the destruction he had created. Naruto. He said softer as he approached the boy. Naruto. Are you okay? The boy made a move to stand, but Minato quickly made a move to press him back down, despite his wince at his own injuries. However, the battle in front of them wasn't going very well. Minato was already low on reserves. He'd overused the high ration, but it wasn't nearly enough. Obito and Kakashi had managed between the two of them, their teamwork keeping them above the water. Rin was here with him, already weakened from healing them so many times and from using her own jutsu. In short, they were all going to die. Oddly, he found his thoughts moving to Naruto. That half smile he gave when his eyes were distant, like he was looking somewhere far away where Minato couldn't follow. The ocean color of his eyes, so much like his own. The way he appraised Minato as a person, not as some sort of legendary demigod, some sort of hero. Minato squeezed his eyes shut. He shouldn't be thinking about this now. Why was he giving up? Why did he think of Naruto in these last few moments, a boy he'd barely met, and yet there was such a strong pull that he felt with him? He wasn't thinking of Rin, Obito, or Kakashi. Wasn't thinking of Jiraiya, who had just returned to see him and congratulate him. Didn't think of the Sandaime, who'd have to work so many more years because he'd be dead. Not of Kushina, who would be crying over his grave until the day she died. He thought of Naruto. Now they were losing a battle against what seemed to be hundreds, whether an exaggeration or not. He'd never see him again. Don't even fucking think about it. Minato's eyes pried themselves open into a sea of fire. Rin stopped shivering in the midst of a sea of enemy ninja, eyes opening to see a world drenched in crimson. She didn't think she'd ever seen so much fire in her life. The entire sky seemed to have turned into hell itself, and when she looked up there were no clouds, no sun, just burning fire. It wasn't the sky on fire. It was the world. An enormous pillar of searing hot flames erupted from the middle of the lines of burning ninja, swaying in the wind and flickering in the sky until everything seemed like it was burning, and there was a man in the middle of it with a shocking head of blonde hair, and for a moment she thought, Minato. But Minato had never seemed so inhuman, had never stood so silently amidst a world full of flames, had never watched her with monstrous red eyes, never had a face like Naruto. She blinked, eyes squinted from the intense light, attempting to make out the figure again. But that enormous pillar tail, maybe? Of fire swung her way again, and blocked her vision of the center of the field. Rin. Minato called, limping with one leg and arm over his eyes. What's going on? Can you see anything? She trailed off, attempting to see once more. I thought I saw. It doesn't matter now. Her sensei shouted. "Get back. Hurry." She stumbled away, grabbing the yondaime before he could injure himself further, attempting to walk, and making for a safer distance, away from the flames which seemed to eat everything with rapture. They made it to the tree line and she was already sweating from the morbid, ungodly heat. She couldn't stop trembling, looking into the sky where fire took to the air like some sort of enormous wing. The heat was unbearable and she was exhausted and her eyes stung from trying to stare into the fire for too long, and Minato was next to her looking lifeless, sprawled in front of a tree with lidded eyes, breathing heavily, and she didn't even know where Obito and Kakashi were, but she could only hope they'd made it out of there in time before everything had exploded into fire. And then, "I've been fine for a while," Minato said honestly, rubbing at his hair. "They're just keeping me here for precaution, I guess. Well, it's good to see you well, my friend." And then, turning to his young teammates, "And how good it is to see you two as well. I take it neither of you were injured?" "No sir." Rin and Obito answered in perfect unison, looking too cowed by the Sandaime's immediate presence for their usual bravado. With that, the old Hokage walked off, only giving a meaningful look to his successor as he passed. Minato wondered what wisdom the man was trying to impart on him, before shaking it off and heading towards Naruto. "What did he talk to you about?" Minato asked quietly. "Your mission?" Naruto paused. "Yeah, something like that," he answered vaguely. "He just gave me a lot to think about." Minato hummed in agreement. "He does that a lot, doesn't he? And, to Naruto's questioning look, seem like he knows everything." "I mean, he does," Naruto agreed. "People really look up to him around here?" Minato sighed wistfully, wondering how long it would be for them to do the same to him. Not that he didn't have the village's adoration, no, they seemed to like him quite a bit. But he didn't quite feel like he'd earned the respect quite yet. Not of many of the veteran shinobi, anyway. Many of them thought him a young upstart who had connived the elderly Hokage into the position. "They'll do the same to you," Naruto told him, for once quite honestly. "You'll be a village hero too." Minato frowned. "How can you be so sure of that?" And the other blonde only gave him that confusing, capricious smile. "Intuition, I suppose." Naruto. Obito barreled head first into the room, noodles hanging limply from his mouth and ramen broth spilling onto Rin, who squawked at the scalding water. The two traipsed in, assortment of food and all, leaping onto stools and making themselves comfortable. Minato only watched fondly as his team proceeded to bombard the blonde with an uncomfortable amount of questions. It was strange, the blonde thought idly, watching Minato snap his fingers in Obito's face. The Uchiha perked up such emotion to his pale face, so unlike Sasuke's impassive features, quickly, and turned to his sensei, who was smiling with bemusement. Rin was handing him chocolate mochi, keeping all the strawberry for herself and leaving all the green tea ones untouched. Naruto was equally thankful for them, even though he'd charged mouth first into the extra bowl Obito had brought along with him. Thankful that she'd even think to bring him any. To include him. Obito somehow managed to wrangle Team 7, plus Naruto and minus Kakashi, who was stuck in the hospital with what seemed to be a terrible bout of infection, into the ramen stand, crowding the small stall with the four of them, but making Tuki into one happy man. "Now, I don't require any answers from you, Naruto," ended the Sandaime magnanimously. "I'm aware that your doings are your own. I've come to some of my own conclusions and quite honestly, I know enough not to question you." And then, with a smirk, "After all, it's never a good idea to mess with time." Naruto looked down guiltily, rubbing at his arm. "Yeah. I guess I really fucked things up, huh?" Sarutobi shook his head. "No, you're embarking on a journey entirely of your own. I've seen the ending, and the beginning too, I suppose. But the middle is up to you. And you'll let me go?" Naruto blinked in surprise. "Just like that?" "What will happen, advised the old man tenderly. "Who am I to get in the way of that?" Though it made quite a bit of sense, Naruto could imagine Jiraiya having quite a few different words to say to that. He didn't truly believe the words himself. What did this mean? Sarutobi had just imparted some of a future that had never happened to him yet, at least, part of his future. To the Sandaime, I was all in the past. How very confusing. Is there anything I should tell our young friend out there? Sandaime changed conversation quickly, the last of his pipe smoking in the air. Naruto snapped back to the man. Friend? And then, oh, you mean Minato? The man would probably have quite a few questions. To be careful. Naruto decided upon finally. And to believe in himself, and follow his dreams. Naruto blinked away the burn in his eyes, wondering where in himself this was drudging up from. Perhaps some part of him he'd buried deep beneath his mind, where it could be treasured and forgotten. This unconditional love he used to hold for the dream he used to have. For the father he had imagined for himself. Sound advice. Perhaps he could use some of your confidence, Naruto. For such an able man, he has very little for himself. The Sandaime noted. And though I'm sure you already know Naruto-kun, my office is open for all those who need it. I know. Naruto smiled, wondering how it was possible for one man to change so little. That was the thing with old men, they didn't change. Just as the Sandaime turned to leave, fear bubbled into his mouth. What if? Naruto's soft voice halted the Sandaime in his tracks. What if I'm messing everything up? Naruto wondered aloud, brokenly, the majority of his deepest fears so forthcoming in the face of his wise teacher and beloved Hokage, lost so long ago. What if the future I make is wrong? If it's a terrible ending that I don't want? You can't change destiny, Naruto-kun. Sarutobi counseled, before pausing. Though, I suppose, if anyone could, it would be you. The moment the Sandaime opened the door, he was met with 3 sheepish faces right on the other side. The old man blinked at their stupidly smiling faces, Team 7 quite obviously aware they'd been caught trying to listen in. Good thing that the Sandaime had made sure to use a silencing jutsu beforehand, for Minato's acute ears would have surely heard everything. Everyone's okay then? Sarutobi smiled. Obito and Rin nodded, blushing. The old man turned to Minato. And you as well? And then, with excitement. Maybe he's getting a medal. Minato shook his head, smile dry of all emotion. Who knows? Why don't we head to the cafeteria though? I could use some food. Of course, sensei. Rin piped up, grabbing him by the hand and physically dragging him down the hall. Obito caught up quick enough, already in better spirits at the thought of food. So, the Sandaime began, amiably enough. Do you mind if I sit down, Naruto-kun? Naruto's eyes never once strayed from the elder shinobi, never once blinked. His heart seemed caught in a cage 3 sizes too small, attempting to struggle its way out with rapid movement. No sure, go ahead. Hiruzen nodded, pulling a chair next to the bed. Now, Naruto-kun, you don't mind if I call you that, do you? It's fine. Naruto answered quickly. Ah well, alright then, Naruto-kun. The man crossed his legs, pulling out his pipe from one of the assorted pockets dotting the inside of his robe, a small flame flickering to life at his fingers, a technique he passed down to Naruto at some point. I figured we may as well get comfortable with each other. I've been told we were very close at some point. There was a moment in which Naruto said nothing at all, blinking the first time since he'd woken up. Then his eyes widened. I'm sorry? His mouth attempted to make more words, but nothing came out. Instead, he sat up higher on the pillows, and tried to swallow all the confusion in his throat. What I mean is, how did you? Let me tell you a story, Naruto. Hiruzen smiled graciously. Would you like to hear it? The blonde rigorously nodded. I met a boy just like you, once. The Sandaime began, after a great heave of his pipe. The thick vanilla smell wafted into the room. He had blonde hair, perhaps a bit wilder, and 3 scars on his cheeks. He'd just began the end to something very tragic, I'd think. He had an expression to his face that I couldn't quite decipher, quite a feat for me, you must understand. There are very few people I can't read clearly. Naruto only nodded numbly, listening with rapture. At any rate, he explained to me that I would be seeing a lot of him. He asked for my forgiveness, though for what, I'm still not sure. Though I insisted he at least stay for tea, as he'd been in the rain this whole time, he declined. He continued to assure me that we'd be seeing a lot of one another, and that we would have quite a lot of tea. He sounded so sure of himself. The Sandame ashed his pipe, still not looking at the blonde on the bed. That was 20 years ago. Naruto's eyes widened. Just after the end of the First Shinobi War. He didn't make much sense to me at the time, this grim man in the rain. I thought him just another ninja, lost after a tumultuous war. Imagine my surprise when I met him a few years later, in a watermelon patch with my newly appointed genin team. But he was different, you see. He was unsure and confused, just as confused as I was. There was no recognition in his eyes. This was a man who had never met me. How strange then, that I remembered his face and his scars from a lifetime ago. And now, in a hospital bed, after apparently saving 4 of my shinobi. Naruto only looked down, unsure of what to say, of even where to begin. The Sandame retained his pensive expression as Minato gazed guiltily at the now awake blonde, seeming to take this all in thought and turn it slowly in his head. Perhaps analyzing the blonde who knew. The Sandame had a veritable reputation of being quite the astute psychoanalyst, a trait he used derisively during his career. Again, that slight tug to the bottom of his gut sharpened as he thought about the Sandame. About his illustrious long-winded career as a ninja that, still, lingered in the aftertaste of each Fire Nation breath, long after he'd stopped being just a ninja. Minato was aware that the Sandame had high hopes for him, and thought him more than qualified for the job. But Minato wasn't so sure himself. After all he saw on the bed was a slightly frightened, defensive teenager, though surely the Sandame saw something else. Minato. Sarutobi began slowly. The blonde broke out of his thoughts. Hokage-sama? Would you mind excusing us for a moment? Hiruzen began with a slight quirking to his lips. I believe our young friend may have some important information for me, though I don't think he'd be comfortable sharing it with you. The brief flare of jealousy that erupted with the words was quickly crushed by Minato. It shouldn't be any of his concern if Sarutobi had something personal with this boy after all. Who was he to say anything about it? They'd only met recently. He surely wasn't anyone of importance in Naruto's life. Of course. He answered easily enough, swallowing through the lump in his throat. Though his joints felt stiff as he exited the room, closing the door behind him, closed his eyes and let out a deep breath, as if finally releasing all the pressure and tension that seemed to hover heavily over the room. Then his eyes snapped open. 2 pairs of guilt-ridden eyes stared up at him from his 2 students on their hands and knees, pressed against the door. You too? Minato sighed, exasperated. Obito leapt to his feet with a sheepish grin, rubbing the back of his head as Rin shamefully crawled off the floor. We were just wondering if Naruto was okay. The girl began hastily. We knew he had woken up, but then the Sandame was the Sandame in Naruto's room? Obito interrupted excitedly. What's going on? Anything cool? Minato wished he knew himself. No, he waved him off. Not that I know of. Oh. Obito drooped, though he still looked mildly curious. So why is the Sandame in there? Good question. Minato quipped, wondering the same himself. Not for the first time, he was a little annoyed at getting left out of the loop. I guess he wanted to ask Naruto some questions. Rin snapped up with wide eyes. Is Naruto getting in trouble? She asked, frightened. I'm not sure. Minato admitted. Well, he didn't think so. Why would the Sandame get mad at Naruto? Obito rolled his eyes, scoffing. Naruto was so badass. I'm sure it's nothing. All right. Minato backed away hastily, hands up in what he assumed to be the universal surrender. I won't. The way Naruto was watching him with unreadable, impassive eyes made rethink his assumption. Are you a Fuinjutsu master? Obito was already halfway in his face. I hear they're all super cool sealing masters. Well yes, but no way. Rin had jumped up too, the both of them already so close even as Minato attempted to pry them away. Well then you're absolutely from Ashigakure. Have you ever been there? What was it like? Gosh, we learned all about it at the academy and I've always wanted to go. Whoa. Finally, Minato managed to pry them both away from him, leaving Naruto to breath heavily, feeling like he'd been mauled by rabid attack dogs. Let's not kill him with questions, huh? Hey, hey. Rin turned to Minato. Isn't Kushina-san from Ashigakure? Minato blinked. She is. Minato affirmed with a light smile. Naruto remembered to feign ignorance. Kushina-san? He repeated, keeping a touch of confusion in his tone. Sensei's girlfriend. Rin crooned. Minato, for his part, was blushing. Though he most definitely was pleased. Naruto turned to him. Is that true? Well. Yeah. Well, I'm sure she's really nice. Naruto commented neutrally, unsure of what else to say. It wasn't like he could just say, yeah, I already knew that. She's my mom, you know. Oh, and speaking of which, you're my dad. You should meet her. Minato said, before he could stop himself. At Naruto's surprised face, he realized his words. There were very few people that were aware of Minato's relationship with Kushina. And out of that handful, only Jiraiya was aware of how serious they were. His team was aware of her, yes. Met her a few times, even. But most certainly weren't aware of her status as the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, let alone the fact that Minato found himself contemplating the thought of marrying her. He'd never put himself or her so foolishly in danger by making them official, or by telling anyone, let alone a stranger he'd met a few days ago. Like Naruto. Yeah, sure. The other blonde agreed amiably. Yet Minato hadn't even hesitated. But why? It wasn't that he didn't trust the blonde, because oddly, the other Jounin had managed to worm his way through most of Minato's defenses. But they had only met a few days prior. There was something about Naruto. But what was it? I was already angry. Minato pointed out, face turning grim. He looked away. Angry enough to attempt an assassination, even when they hardly have the strength to rebuild. Konoha has bigger problems to worry about than Iwagakure. Naruto waved him off. And they'll cool off, after some negotiations. Most of them, anyway. Naruto knew that even 20 years in the future, Kakashi's name would hold the highest sum in the Iwagakure bingo book. You're really knowledgeable about all these politics and stuff. Rin noted shyly, peering over from being Minato's shoulder. Naruto smiled at her. I was there for a few years, remember? And then, with a laugh. I probably already sound more like a diplomat than a shinobi. But you kick ass on the battlefield. Obito crowed. Naruto only attempted to laugh it off. What was that technique, anyway? Rin asked, curiously. The one that kind of looked like Sensei's. At the mention of the Rasengan-like technique they'd seen that day, Minato's curiosity was piqued as well. Naruto swallowed. Well, it's just something I made up. I have a wind affinity, you see, so it's sort of made to work like a vacuum. And in the other one? Obito broke in, and Naruto almost cried in relief at Obito's unbridled excitement for once coming in handy. The big fire thingy that's a blood limit. Naruto cutting quickly. Never seen a blood limit like that. There are a lot of them you haven't seen. Minato shushed the Uchiha swiftly, rolling his eyes. Konoha's not the only place that has them, you know. And think of how many we have, just in the village. Rin hummed. Well, there's the Inuzuka, the Akimaki, the Yamanaka, the Nara, the Hyuga and the Uchiha, of course. Minato nodded sternly. Trust the blondes to turn this into some sort of teacher-student lecture. That's right. There's lots of them all over the world. That's gotta be millions, then. Not that many. The Yondaime chuckled. They're still fairly uncommon. But there are quite a few. And then, to Naruto. Where does yours originate from? Put on the spot, Naruto could only open his mouth, half words and thoughts tumbling out of his mouth. Well, I get it from my mother. Well, I don't know much about her. But she came from Ashigakure, I think. But Ashigakure? Rin gasped, excitedly. Wow. You know, that place doesn't exist anymore. While simultaneously, Minato's brows pulled together. Ashigakure? As Obito jumped up, wicked. Overwhelmed, Naruto only blinked at them all. And then, finally. I didn't know I was such a big deal. He croaked out. Big deal? Rin echoed incredulously. You're from Ashigakure? Not really. Naruto protested hastily. My mom's from there, or well, I think she's half from there. Anyway, I don't really know, serves him right. The bottomless pit was saying around his noodles, the fourth bowl of the day, apparently. I always tell him to spray some disinfectant, but he thinks he's too cool for that kind of stuff. That stupid kid. Obito snorted, referring to said sick teammate. You're a stupid kid too. Rin pointed out with spite. And don't be so mean to Kakashi. You know, Nurse Ranma told me that he was hallucinating. Isn't that crazy? Poor Kakashi. But Obito only choked on his laughter. Oh god. That's priceless. What about? Rin-chan, let's visit him tomorrow, okay? And bring your camera. No. Shrieked Rin, shocked. Minato was seated next to Naruto, looking down at his broth. But Naruto could make out his sour expression, like he was fighting off his smile. He couldn't keep his mind off of what the Sandame had said. He hadn't given Naruto more to think about. He blew his mind. Did that mean he'd time travel even more in the future? Was this some sort of ominous prophecy of things to come? He couldn't even wrap his mind around it. He'd heard about the future from someone who'd lived it in the past. Did it make sense? Could it make sense? You okay there, Naruto? The blonde blinked, mirrored Windsor blue eyes staring back at him with concern. You look a bit pale. Minato added as an afterthought. Though it was a little hard to tell with the tan the other blonde was sporting. This close though, the yandame could make out the almost grayish shade of blue to the other's eyes, the speckle of Prussian around the iris and the spray of almost freckles lined around his lashes. I'm fine. Naruto waved him off hastily, taking a long gulp of the leftover broth in his bowl. Well, he was certainly eating healthily, that was for sure. The blonde jounin from the future wiped at his mouth with his sleeve, thoughts suddenly twisting to the Hokage in front of him. Who'd have thought that the infamous Yandame, one of the most renowned Hokage in recent history, could be so insecure? To think that the fearless man of history was scared of the opinions of a handful of civilians. Albeit, Konoha may be a bit more than a handful. But the man faced down the nine-tailed demon fox. Surely he hadn't been scared then. Right? Naruto's eyes lingered on the other blonde, who had turned to grab Obito under his arm for a vicious noogie. Rin's howl of laughter muted by his own thoughts. Surely, at the very end, he hadn't regretted it. Naruto had always assumed that Minato had just sort of thought that he was doing what was best for his people, had just kind of thought that the village would think of the blonde as some sort of hero, and that life would carry on happily. But a small part of him thought back to the Minato against the dim underwash of hospital grays, sunlight nebulized by the distance and his eyes vulnerable. By the time he'd surfaced from the murky waters of his musings, Obito was subdued, hair wilder than it had been before, and Rin had regained her breath to lightly pick at her salad once more. Minato was watching the two of them again, with that fond expression he'd had in the hospital. You're doing a good job. Naruto found himself saying, wondering why he thought Minato even wanted to hear this. The yandame turned to him, confused. Huh? With them? He nudged to the man's two genin students. And with Konoha? For a moment, the older blonde said nothing at all, only wearing a look of vague incomprehension, before a shy, hesitant smile took to his face. You think so? He asked quietly. Naruto felt his gut twist in guilt at the hopefulness in Minato's voice. He'd hated this man for the longest time. Condemned him in his mind for the deepest pit in hell. Yes. He answered, regardless. No. Naruto was quick to protest. No. It's just, well, my mom's from there. Well, she's kind of from there. But my dad isn't. From any ninja clan, I don't think. So I usually just say I'm from Ashigakure. Huh. Kushina praised. You wouldn't happen to have known her clan name, would you? Uzumaki. Naruto's mind supplied bitterly. Why yes, I would. No. He answered, aloud. I didn't really know much about her. The woman's stern eyes softened. Oh, I see. Then she extended her hand. At first, Naruto thought she was trying to shake his hand, but then he caught sight of the tattoo on the back of her hand. The spiral. The sign of Ashigakure. I'm from Ushi. It's been long time since I've met anyone else from there. I've never been. He answered, honestly. By the time I was born. I dunno. It just never came up in any of my travels. Travels? Kushina echoed, suddenly perking up. Do you travel? I do. He answered, honestly. Much farther than you'll ever know. Naruto wasn't sure how to handle the curious expression on her face. And you guys. Naruto could have sighed in relief, as Kushina's eyes tore away from his own to make out Obito and Rin amidst the sea of shifting people. They'd somehow walked out into one of the main roads, full of Konoha at its highest peak of shopping. Rin and Obito trekked their way over, Rin coming to a full halt in front of Minato, the older blonde looking confused at her sly face until she opened her mouth. Good morning, Hokage-sama. Minato was quick to slap a hand over his wiggling genin's mouth. Not so loud. He hissed, looking around. No one seemed to have heard her. 20 years in the future, and had Minato walked down the street, there wouldn't be a single person who wouldn't have stopped to stare. Perhaps it was just a posthumous reputation, however, for no one seemed particularly interested in the jounin with a blonde mop of hair. Calm down. Kushina rolled her eyes. You're not that famous. And with special relish to Minato's relieved expression, she added, yet. I can't wait for the coronation. Rin squealed, before ribbing Obito. We get front row seats, right? Of course. Minato rubbed at his head, grinning. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Sarutobi-sama still has a few months in him left. Doubt it. Obito snorted. Last I heard he was already planning a vacation to Kirigakure. Minato's eyes widened. No. Who did you hear that from? Those chonin at the guard post. Let's eat. Kushina clapped her hands, cutting in swiftly. That's enough about Hokage stuff for today, huh? The comely woman easily maneuvered Minato plus Rin and Obito down the street, subtly switching the conversation over to lighter waters. Naruto frowned, plodding along next to Rin. How strange. Kushina had almost looked uncomfortable at the thought of Minato becoming Hokage. Did she not want the pressure that would come upon them? Or just didn't want Minato to be Hokage? He'd expected some nin to come around, even though the departure was certainly more strenuous than the arrival. The amount of chakra used to do so would at least alert someone. But Naruto's eyes caught with the woman descending from the trees, and his mind short-circuited. The amount of familiarity in Kushina's face was startling. Not nearly as much as Minato, but equally there, subtler around the eyes and in the curve of her chin, the bow of her mouth. The wind picked at her long, fiery hair, just as her eyes strained onto Naruto. There was a brief moment in which she said nothing at all, too shocked at how much the boy resembled Minato to do much else aside from stare in silent appraisal. His skin was tanner, yes, lending him a more golden shade, and though his face only vaguely resembled the other man's, just the nose and the brows, perhaps, but everything else seemed just as familiar, though she couldn't place from where. It was the eyes that really caught at her. Those were Minato's eyes. On someone else. Naruto. Minato called out, looking surprised and relieved at the same time. Kushina blinked in confusion. As Minato hedged closer to the younger boy. Minato never voluntarily let someone invade his personal space, aside from her and perhaps Jiraiya. He was looking the boy over avidly, checking for wounds. Are you alright? The lemon-haired boy grinned sheepishly. I'm fine. He insisted. I just put too much into that last attack. Put too much? Kushina thought, bewildered. That was a lot of chakra. More than the average ninja would have. Put too much? Minato voiced her thoughts aloud. You could have blown up something with that. Could have blown up yourself. You think? Naruto pondered curiously, looking entertained at the thought. Inwardly, he was mentally going through possible places far enough not to alert nearby nin of the seal's use. But how far? The middle of Kumo far? The boy's eyes slid to his mother's, not unsurprised to find her looking at him as well. Oh. Minato looked between the two. I haven't introduced you to yet. The boy peered curiously at her, but with a certain impassivity she didn't think she was supposed to catch. She tried to shake off the strange, unexplainable feeling of familiarity at his face, at the way his face split open with a grin. "I'm Kushina." She spoke first, voice strong, just like he'd imagined it to be. "Hi." He shook himself out of his daze. "I'm Naruto." His mother's voice, it was almost calling back to him. Like he was remembering it from a half-remembered dream, long washed in a sea of memories. Minato eased the unsure tension out of the trio easily enough. "Cool. Hey, let's go meet my team already, huh? Obito's been looking for you, Naruto." The other blonde perked up, happily confused. "Me? Yeah, he's been dying to pick your brain for jutsu." Minato nodded. "Thinks you're some sort of Ashigakure warrior god or something." "Ashigakure?" Kushina interrupted, immediately. "You're from Ashigakure?" It was only on the rarest of occasions that Kushina and Minato were able to meet publicly, however obscure it may seem. Even a deserted tea shop like this had Minato jumpy and on edge, glancing at the doors as if he expected the entirety of Iwagakure to come bearing down on the shoji screen. "Stop looking so mad." She leaned back, adjusting herself on her pillow. "It makes your face look sour." "I don't look sour," Minato retorted, a steady pout forming on his face. It only took one grin from Kushina until he was grinning back. "You do," she crooned. "Like you've swallowed soured plum. Kinda like a fish, see?" To demonstrate, she pursed her lips and squished her cheeks with her hands. Minato quickly put an end to it, kissing her solidly on the mouth until she giggled into it, laughing and pulling away. Everything about Kushina was beautiful. The fiery red hair and the green blue to her eyes. But most of all that soft smile reserved entirely for him. He fingered the ring in his pocket. He'd been thinking about it all yesterday. How was he supposed to find the perfect time? Plan a date at a fancy restaurant? But it was too crowded, everyone would see, and Kushina hated places like that, anyway. In their house? But how plain? With his team, perhaps, but he wasn't even sure if he wanted them to know. He'd been fretting about it all morning as well, happy for the distraction as she dragged him to her favorite tea shop, desolate so early in the morning. But why not now? She loved this place and their goddamn chai tea more than anything else in the world, perhaps even him, just as she loved mornings as the sun began to rise. And how could he not, when she looked so lovely, dazzling him with her beguiling smile, sun catching at her hair and sloping down her shoulder like an arch of gold. He cleared his throat. "So, Kushina." And the both of them jolted up, as a surge of chakra seemed to plow right through him like a burst of killer intent. Minato immediately sprung to his feet, head snapped to the direction of the overwhelming amount of chakra. Like a bomb had just been dropped, ripping through the air and alerting everyone to its presence. What was that? Kushina stood as well, peering out the window. Minato attempted to pull her back, away from the only opening, but she only waved him off. "The birds are scared," he noted. "But I don't smoke." Minato looked out as well. The sky was dotted with dark silhouettes, birds taking to the sky in long circular patterns. But there was no smoke, only the subtle blue of the sky and the line of trees. Kushina turned to him, eyes wide and excited. "Let's investigate." "What?" he snorted, incredulously. "That's Ridike. Hold on." But Kushina was already half out the door, taking flight with the birds, wind singing in her hair. He stumbled after her, steadying his footing before leaping into the trees after her. They crossed through the sky, and he eyed the horizon. There was a curious lack of other nin. They had been pretty far from the village, but not terribly. The shockwave seemed to have literally ripped through him, but maybe had been small enough not to alert the presence of the entire village. Naruto had just dropped out of his own seal, falling to the ground unpleasantly and groaning at the headache he was now sporting. Typical of this stupid seal and its stupid imprecision. Was it possible he'd used too much chakra this time? He wasn't sure. Quickly, the blonde pocketed the anchor seal on the ground, rolling it into a scroll and shoving it onto one of the containers in his belt just in time, too, as two nin came bolting out of the thick canopy of trees. He wasn't nearly as surprised with Minato as he was with the blonde's red-headed companion. If only she hadn't smiled at all that way, The overwhelming tide of grief wouldn't have knocked him over and sent him spiraling down into his own wrenching self-hate. Because, beneath all those smiles and all those jokes, he'd managed to come to an awareness that had only lingered in the undercurrent of his subconscious. A realization he'd been heading towards, but had attempted to delay. That he was the first to leave, turning his face into the glowing sun, into the world doused in gold. She turned away as well, into Konoha, creased in shadows. He didn't even want to be here. The hill was so steep that Jiraiya could have posed as a bumbling old hermit, squatting at the top to catch a glimpse of a glorious sunrise. The old man had already courteously drawn it out himself, and Naruto immediately recognized the design they'd come up with together. The blonde felt a bit of pride knowing that he'd made most of it. Jiraiya had only egged him on a bit, advising but generally leaving creation up to Naruto. And while it had its flaws, the surge of chakra being one of the more irritable nuances, Naruto was still proud of what he'd come up with. How far he'd come. Jiraiya was waiting patiently by the seal, legs crossed and arms folded, face turned into the sun. "You." The blonde greeted. The Toad Sandman nodded, eyes still closed into the warm light. "You say goodbye?" "Yeah," Naruto answered, stiffly. He stepped into the seal, onto the fond patterns he'd painstakingly created. "You don't sound too happy." "I'm not good with goodbyes." The blonde shrugged. "No guilt." He scowled. How did Jiraiya always know what for? The Jounin retorted, angrily beginning the hand seals. What did Jiraiya know, anyway? He wasn't the one standing on this paper, unknowingly poised between two roads he couldn't follow. Wasn't stuck with this forlorn longing that Naruto knew was wrong, yet was too strong for him to stop. And he knew if Jiraiya made him stop this now, told him this experiment was over and crushed this seal, that he'd do everything in his power to get back there. "You're a lucky guy, Naruto." Jiraiya praised wanly. The seal erupted in a burst of brilliant blue, before it left nothing but a sky full of monstrous, rolling clouds and an old man on a hill. The Sanding looked down at the paper crumbling in on itself, on the design made from blackened ink. On the design Naruto had made almost entirely by his own doing, such a work of genius for a boy so young. "I hope you change the world." When he and Jiraiya had begun their trek out of Konoha, he hadn't expected Sakura to come to say goodbye. Jiraiya had gone ahead of him, and Sakura had asked him to stay back. She had silently grabbed his hand as he turned to walk through the gates, and, just as silently, he met Jiraiya's eyes. He wasn't sure what message was conveyed in the man's burning gaze, but it almost seemed more than he understood. Nonetheless, the Sannin nodded, turning away and heading off alone. The sun was just starting its ascension into heaven. The day was new and soft, like a bursting peach of color. The sunny dim, benign presence at the edge of the horizon. Sakura would remember the way Naruto's hair was bright and tousled, bleeding gold at the edges in the early light that painted the ground in long strokes. The way he was almost unidentifiable in this bleeding saffron painting she'd never seen before, with this indomitable protagonist standing like a tragic prelude in the foreground, windy hair and cloudy eyes. Little did she know that Naruto was appraising the same of her. Half of her was painted in that same burning light, the other marred by long, narrow shadows tagging at her clothing and the edge of her nose. The determined seaweed green of her eyes, calloused hands and arms lined with medical seals painted to her elbows. They'd both become heroes in two separate stories. "Don't look at me like that," he began jokingly, unsure of what else to say. For a moment, he remembered with absurd clarity that it was Sakura who was the last to see Sasuke in Konoha. That it was Sakura who had pleaded him to stay. That it was Sakura now, watching him like they were coming up to some sort of crossroad he hadn't been aware was there. Like what? She tilted her head, smile creasing her cheeks. "Like you were about to do something stupid?" He pulled a face. Her smile widened. "You are." She nudged him playfully. "I don't do stupid things like that anymore," he denied. And then added, unhelpfully, "But if the monument ends up neon-colored, don't be too surprised." She rolled her eyes. "I'll blame Konohamaru." "For that, yes." Naruto nodded. "And when it glows in the dark then you can blame me." You didn't actually do that. She gave him an incredulous look. Before, did you? Of course not. Naruto scoffed, though really, it was up to debate. I'm not 12 anymore, Sakura-chan. Sure, don't act like it. She teased, smirking. Her smile fell, then. Naruto wished he could have kept it there, if not for a bit longer. It had been a long time since he'd seen her smile so wide, like all their concerns mattered so little. Naruto he braced himself for it, visibly, even. The, I'm worried for you and all the, I miss you-s that would inevitably follow, quickly affirmed with the crestfallen, heartbreaking look that only Sakura could achieve so unnervingly beautifully. Instead, it was even worse. I believe in you, Naruto blanched. So it seemed he'd inadvertently met Itachi, too. Of course I know. Makoto huffed. I knew since that day Minato rescued her from those Kumonin. I was under the impression it wasn't common news around here. Oh, it's most certainly not. Think of what would happen if people found out, if I found out. Kushina's already in a delicate position, being from Mushi and all, and that makes it even more difficult to be with Minato. Let alone the fact that she's a... Makoto trailed off, meeting Naruto's eyes before looking away. A Jinchuriki. Naruto offered. So you knew that too? Makoto whispered, looking a tad surprised. He shrugged. I've met a few. I'm pretty good with chakra identification, so it's easy to tell them apart. The Uchiha took this in stride, nodding. They'll have a lot of problems, I'm sure, but I really just want them to be happy. They will be. Naruto answered with brimming honesty. Even now, I think they're happy. Confused, and a little unsure, but definitely happy. You think so? Makoto gave him a curious tilt of her head. I know so. He affirmed. He found himself at the end of a deep, gray gaze, one he'd seen before. Such conviction. She murmured. Are you looking out for them? They came to a pause at the gates to the Uchiha compound, Naruto not even realizing they'd walked so far. Naruto blinked, unsure. I guess so. He ended, lamely. I want to see them happy, too. He must have passed some sort of test in her eyes, because the Uchiha gave a nod of affirmation before rummaging in her hair. She came up with a glimmering silver strand, a necklace at the end of it. Here, I want you to have this. It was a double swirl patterned necklace, but colored black and red. Naruto wondered what was up with him and getting jewelry from girls. It's a sign of good luck. Makoto gave him a happy little smile. Generally, they're shaped like Uchiha fans. It's a clan thing, but I feel like this suits you more. I can't take this from you. Naruto declined quickly. I mean, if it's yours it's okay. She waved him off, pulling out another one from underneath her shirt. I have another one. Kushina-chan has one too, we can be matching. Me? Sure. Naruto said, for lack of a response. I'm sure you'll do a good job, looking after them. For a moment, Naruto thought of Sakura, and her unshakable conviction in him. He wondered what about him inspired people to believe in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. We can take turns. Makoto's eyes shifted up over his head, catching something in the sky. Naruto looked up too, to find a hawk circling slowly above them. That must be for you. Makoto noted. Well, I'll be going then. Good luck, Naruto-kun. She gave him a final wave, before heading into the Uchiha compound. Naruto wondered how she could be so sure it was his. She was a ninja too, after all. Though Kunoichi only took off from work when Naruto could only scowl. What a load of bull. Man, no wonder no one ever connected him with the fourth, despite the fact that they may as well have been identical twins. Clearly, no one knew the fourth even had the ability, or the chance to procreate. The Mikostas came out after that, ushering them in with a graceful little bow, which Kushina easily plowed right over. She then began to imperiously demand another seat for Makoto, who only half-heartedly attempted to reassure the staff that no, Kushina wasn't going to sue them and bring the entire restaurant down, she just wanted another seat. It was a little hard to tell the difference, though. By the time they'd fully settled, Kushina sandwiched between Naruto and Makoto, Minato and his team had come back, Rin with more books than it looked like she could carry. Rin was first to delve straight into a conversation about literature, and no one but Naruto seemed to catch Minato's dismayed look at seeing Kushina without an empty chair. Naruto moved around uncomfortable, unsure of whether he should give Minato his seat or stay where he was. But Kushina's hand clamped around his knee like a steel grip, and he stayed where he was. Lunch, from another perspective other than his own, was a light-hearted affair full of cheer-uppy anecdotes and a few humorous jokes, like old friends catching up after a long time. But all Naruto could do was toy with his chopsticks, wondering about how little he knew, how much was really left to gather dust in history. Naruto wasn't entirely sure how he managed to walk Mikoto home, but the two were going in the same direction, and Naruto supposed he may as well be courteous enough to walk with her even though he was still having issues at looking straight at her face. "You really don't have to," insisted Mikoto kindly, as everyone parted their separate ways. Minato and his team to visit Kakashi in the hospital and Kushina well, Naruto wasn't entirely sure. She left in a bit of a hurry. "Nah, I'm going this way, anyway." And then, with a grin, "I'm sure that Fugaku-san wouldn't want you walking home alone, anyway. That Fugaku-san conveniently forgets I'm a kunoichi, and can take care of myself." Mikoto snorted, before brightening. "But it is very nice of you." "Thank you, Naruto-san. It really isn't a problem, Mikoto-san." Mikoto blinked at the formality, even though she used it herself. "It's just Mikoto." She smiled. "Then it's just Naruto." He smiled back. Oh god. He wasn't flirting with Sasuke's mom, was he? Of course not. He mentally slapped himself in the face. That's disturbing. To think this light-hearted woman birthed the two most notoriously stoic Uchiha in history, one of which who even destroyed his own clan. "So, how do you know Kushina-chan?" "I don't. I'm friends with Minato, though, and we just happened to meet up, and you know how Rin-chan is with. I wonder who came up with that." Mikoto snorted, interrupting him. "Those two are so transparent. They might be fooling everyone else, but they're definitely not fooling me, you know?" Naruto cut off, incredulously. "About, Minato and Kushina? Kushina-chan?" Kushina's face immediately lit up, focusing on someone behind Naruto. The blonde turned around only to see Sasuke running towards him. Oh wait. Sasuke wasn't a petite woman. Mikoto Uchiha came to a halt in front of her best friend, giving her an ecstatic hug that pulled the taller woman straight off her feet. Kushina squawked, wriggling in her best friend's arms until the smaller kunoichi put her down. Naruto was trying not to faint. He may have met Mikoto, or Fugaku, and somewhere in the recesses of his mind were two Uchiha with vague, swimming pale faces and dark eyes. Mikoto came into view with disturbing clarity, her cute, small nose and big black eyes. Sasuke's cute, small nose and big black eyes. Ew. Sasuke looked so much like his mother that Naruto just decided that, to keep the two very, very far apart in his mind, he just wouldn't look at her. "What are you doing here?" Mikoto asked, with a bright, happy smile. "God, I haven't seen you in months. Where the hell have you been?" "Around," Kushina answered with a sly smile. "And I'm waiting in this goddamn line for my tempura. This is crazy, you know? I remember when this place was empty all the time and we'd come to study for our academy exams." Mikoto finished with a giggle. "It's really been that long, huh? It's ridiculous." Kushina agreed, before remembering Naruto. "Naruto," she barked. "This is Mikoto. Praise the ground she walks on." Naruto gave an embellished bow, making Mikoto stifle laughter. "How do you do, Mikoto-sama?" "Don't listen to her." Mikoto waved him off with a playful smile. "I'm no lady. Not yet, anyway." Kushina crowed. "Where is that fool Fugaku, anyway?" "On a mission." Mikoto chirruped. "He's going to be gone until tonight, so I was thinking of picking up some tempura. You should join us." Kushina interrupted with glee. "I'm having lunch here with Minato-san." "Minato-san? And his team? The Hokage, huh?" Mikoto's voice turned sly, and Naruto was suddenly struck by the fact that this woman who seemed to clearly know Kushina well hadn't any idea that the two of them were dating. "Oh, Kushina-chan. It's not like that. Kushina was quick to hurry out. I'm just good friends with little Rin-chan, you know. He found himself observing a deeper level to his parents' relationship than he had first thought. The way Jiraiya spoke of them. They were a happy, light-hearted couple with few problems. Though his mother was known for her spitfire temper, he'd never actually heard any evidence of it. Generally, people spoke of her warmly, or respectfully, those who knew her, anyway. And the few who were aware of Minato and Kushina's relationship, and the fact that they had him, were quick to refer to them almost like a fairy tale couple. Though he saw very little of this now. Kushina led them towards her favorite tempura restaurant, a few blocks away. Naruto couldn't help but notice how every time Minato seemed to get closer to her, she'd delicately move away. He frowned. Wait? Kushina pouted. The hostess only gave them a slightly empathetic glance. I'm sorry. She shrugged. But it is lunchtime. A party of 5. It'll be around 20 minutes. I'll be sure to call you over when your table is ready. Kushina huffed, turning away from the stands and the busy tempura house, looking almost overcrowded with the amount of people. Rin had somehow roped both Obito and Minato into crossing the street with her, to where an enormous bookstore sprawled over the majority of the corner, leaving Kushina and Naruto to wait for their table alone. He eyed the woman from the side, unsure of what to say. Everything he knew of his mother seemed to have been judiciously turned right side up, and now he was struggling to sift through all the debris, trying to pick at the only truths he had left. Do you like him? Sadly, he hadn't inherited Minato's tactful conversational cues. And some say he favored his mother in that regard. Excuse me? The woman turned around in a flurry of burling red hair, looking mildly offended. Minato, I mean. He nudged his head to where the other blonde appeared. It's just. You seem to be avoiding him. What are you, tactical intelligence? Kushina snorted. It's in a shinobi's best interest to understand behaviors. Naruto answered, neutrally. Kushina seemed to appraise him, as if judging his character through her gray, sky-like eyes. For a while, Naruto let her, keeping his face decidedly impassive, letting her peruse what she liked. Of course I like him. She answered with a sigh that seemed to deflate her entirely. That's not the problem. Then what? Naruto titled his head. His reputation? That he'll be the yondaime soon? That he's infamous and will someday be all of the above. Kushina cut in, exasperated. She threw her hands up. Naruto was caught in her vibrance. But it's more than that. She looked away. It's me. Really. I'm just Idano. I'm me. And Minato is Minato. There's a lot of difference right there. That doesn't have to mean anything if you don't want it to. Naruto pointed out quietly. It doesn't matter what I think. Kushina sniffed, crossing her arms. She looked a lot like him at that moment, arms folded against her chest and face tilted away. So stubborn and mulish, the opposite of Minato, easygoing and eager to please. He just doesn't see it like I do. I don't think he cares, which is good, in a way. He doesn't worry about what other people think, what they will think when he becomes Hokage. I mean, he's going to be the yondaime. She croaked out. And I imagine Naruto was surprised she would even confide in him with something of that magnitude, and she looked surprised herself. Luckily, perhaps for both of them, they were interrupted by a sweet, feminine voice.